There is a place in America so vast, so ancient, so impossibly layered with time, that even standing at its edge, even staring down into it with your own eyes, your brain refuses to fully accept what it is seeing. The Grand Canyon, 1 mile deep, 277 miles long, 18 miles wide at its broadest point, a wound in the earth so enormous that you could drop entire mountain ranges into it and they would vanish. Scientists have been studying it for over 150 years. They have lowered themselves on ropes into its depths. They have floated its river on wooden boats and rubber rafts. They have drilled core samples from its walls and sent those samples to laboratories around the world. They have mapped every layer, catalogued every fossil, named every rock formation. They thought they understood it. They were wrong, because buried inside the Grand Canyon, hidden in places the casual tourist never reaches, tucked into alcoves and sealed chambers and remote tributaries that require days of hiking to approach, there are things that do not belong, things that challenge not just the official timeline of American history, but the entire story we have told ourselves about who first walked this continent and when. Things so unexpected, so inexplicable, so deeply strange that the scientists who encountered them did not immediately rush to announce their findings to the world. They went quiet. Some of them went very quiet for a very long time, and that silence, maybe even more than the discoveries themselves, is what should make you lean forward and pay attention. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Because what we are going to explore tonight is not a fringe theory cooked up on the internet. It is not the invention of treasure hunters or conspiracy enthusiasts. The story we are about to walk through is built on actual expeditions, actual newspaper accounts, actual Smithsonian correspondence, actual bones and artifacts and architectural remains that were physically removed from the canyon and, in many cases, never seen publicly again. It is a story that begins not in the 1900s, but hundreds of thousands of years before the first pharaoh sat on any throne. And it is a story that is still, right now, in the 21st century, generating new questions that nobody in an official position seems particularly eager to answer. So settle in. The canyon is deep, the mystery is deeper, and we are going all the way down. Before we get to the discoveries, you need to understand what the Grand Canyon actually is, because most people who have not stood at its rim and felt their knees go slightly weak from the sheer scale of it tend to think of it as a big hole. A scenic big hole. Sure, a tourist attraction. A place you photograph at sunset and put on a postcard. But the Grand Canyon is not just a hole. It is a library. It is the most complete geological record on the surface of our planet. A place where the Earth itself has been split open and laid bare, exposing rock layers that represent nearly 2 billion years of planetary history, stacked one on top of another, like the pages of an unimaginably ancient book. The youngest rocks at the top of the canyon, the pale cream limestone that forms the rim where visitors stand and stare, were deposited roughly 270 million years ago. That is already so old it is difficult to comprehend. 270 million years ago, the continents were still locked together in the supercontinent called Pangaea. The dinosaurs had not yet appeared. The first mammals were perhaps 60 million years in the future. And yet those are the young rocks, the top layer, the recent history. Go deeper, and the numbers become almost surreal. The dark Vishnu basement rocks at the very bottom of the canyon, the rocks that line the banks of the Colorado River where it churns through the inner gorge, those rocks are approximately 1.8 billion years old. Nearly 2 billion years. If you compressed all of Earth's history into a single calendar year, those rocks would have formed in early February. You would not appear until the last few hours of December 31st. And it is through this library of geological time, through these walls of ancient stone, that explorers began to notice things. Chambers cut into cliff faces that the wind and water alone could not have shaped. Passages that seemed too regular, too deliberate in their orientation. Cave openings in positions that would have required significant effort to reach, as though whoever placed them there did not want them found easily, or perhaps wanted them found only by those willing to make the climb. The official history of the Grand Canyon begins with the Spanish explorer Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, who became the first European to look down into the canyon in 1540. He spent 3 days there with his men, trying to figure out a way down to the Colorado River below, and failed. The canyon defeated him completely. For the next 250 years, Europeans essentially ignored it, too remote, too difficult, too inhospitable to bother with. It was not until 1869 that a one-armed Civil War veteran named John Wesley Powell led the first documented expedition through the canyon by river, a journey so dangerous that 3 of his men chose to climb out rather than continue, and were killed by unknown assailants on the plateau above. Powell's expedition opened the canyon to scientific inquiry. Geologists followed, archaeologists followed, survey teams, mining companies, government expeditions. And in the decades that followed Powell's voyage, as more and more of the canyon's remote corners were explored and documented, something began to accumulate. A collection of reports, of observations, of artifacts and accounts that the official narrative of American prehistory had no comfortable place for. But none of those accumulating oddities quite prepared anyone for what was reported in the spring of 1909. The year was 1909. Theodore Roosevelt had left the presidency 2 months earlier. The Ford Model T was transforming American roads. And in the canyon state of Arizona, which had not yet achieved statehood, a man named G.E. Kincaid was finishing a long solo expedition down the Colorado River when he climbed out of the water and up into the canyon walls and found something that, if the accounts are accurate, should have rewritten every textbook on American history. Every single one. The story broke, not in a scientific journal, but in the Arizona Gazette, a Phoenix newspaper, on the 5th of April, 1909. The headline was almost comically understated given what the article claimed. Explorations in Grand Canyon, it read. Mysteries of immense high cavern being brought to light. And then the article told its story. According to the Gazette account, Kincaid was an experienced explorer working under the direction of S.A. Jordan, a professor affiliated with the Smithsonian Institution. Kincaid had been traveling the Colorado River for months when, at a location approximately 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, he noticed something on the canyon wall, a stain of greenish copper ore, and above it, at what the article described as nearly inaccessible height, an entrance, a doorway cut into the cliff face. Kincaid climbed to it. This alone would have been a significant achievement, since the canyon walls in this region are among the most technically demanding terrain in North America. But he made it. And what he found inside, according to the Arizona Gazette, was not a natural cave at all. It was a complex. A deliberately constructed network of passages and chambers reaching deep into the canyon wall, stretching, by Kincaid's estimation, nearly a mile into the cliff. The main corridor ran straight as an arrow, with additional passages branching off in a cruciform pattern, like the arms of a cross. The walls were smooth. The construction was deliberate. This was architecture, and the contents of those chambers, if the Gazette account is to be believed, were extraordinary. In one of the chambers, Kincaid reportedly found a crypt, and in that crypt were mummies. Not one mummy, not 2, but mummies, wrapped in a dark fabric that preserved them against the dry canyon air. The mummies were described as gigantic, significantly taller than any Native American population known to inhabit the region. Some accounts put their height at approximately 6 to 7 feet. Others, in later retellings, pushed the number higher, though those embellishments should be treated with appropriate skepticism. But the core claim, that the mummies were notably large, appeared in the original newspaper account. In other chambers, the expedition reportedly found artifacts of a most unusual character. Copper weapons and copper tools of sophisticated design. Pottery decorated with symbols that bore no resemblance to any known southwestern artistic tradition. Tablets carved with a script or hieroglyphic system that none of the investigators could identify or read. Stone idols. A granary. What Kincaid described as a shrine with a dominant idol, a figure in a sitting position with its legs crossed in a manner he compared to images of the Buddha. That detail, the seated figure, the crossed legs, the general iconographic impression of something vaguely Eastern rather than distinctly American, would become the most controversial element of the entire discovery. Because if the artifact was accurately described, it suggested a cultural connection to something from across the ocean. Something from a civilization not supposed to have had any contact with the American continent in any era that conventional history is willing to discuss. The Gazette article continued. It described hieroglyphic tablets, bearing symbols reminiscent of ancient Egyptian writing. It described weapons of a material and workmanship foreign to anything previously found in North America. It described a maze of connecting rooms, some of which the expedition had not yet had time to fully explore. And then the article named the institution behind the work. The Smithsonian Institution, it stated, was aware of the discovery and was preparing to conduct a full-scale investigation. That claim would prove to be one of the most contested parts of the entire story. Within days of the Arizona Gazette's article, researchers began attempting to verify it. And here is where the story takes its first sharp turn into the territory of genuine mystery, a territory from which it never quite emerges. The Smithsonian Institution, when contacted, denied any knowledge of an expedition led by anyone named Jordan. They denied any knowledge of a man named Kincaid working under their auspices. They denied any knowledge of a discovery of the nature described. The institution had no record of any of it. As far as the Smithsonian was officially concerned, the Grand Canyon cavern discovery of 1909 had never happened. Now, there are several possible explanations for this, and over the century since the article appeared, proponents of very different positions have advanced very different interpretations. The skeptical position is straightforward. The story was a fabrication. Newspapers in 1909 were not held to the same standards of verification that we expect today, and sensational stories about archaeological discoveries were a reliable way to sell papers. The Arizona Gazette, on this view, either invented the story entirely or was fed a hoax by Kincaid or someone else and printed it without adequate fact-checking. The Smithsonian denial, on this reading, is simply the accurate institutional response to a fictional account. The alternative position is considerably more troubling. On this view, the discovery was real, and the Smithsonian denial was not a correction of a fictional account, but a suppression of a factual one. The reasons for such suppression could range from the banal, bureaucratic embarrassment at losing track of a significant find, to the genuinely alarming, a deliberate institutional decision to conceal evidence that conflicted with the established narrative of American prehistory. And then there is a third position, perhaps the most intellectually honest one, which is this: we do not know. The evidence available to us is insufficient to reach a definitive conclusion, and that insufficiency is itself suspicious. Because here is the thing about the Kincaid story that makes the simple hoax explanation feel slightly uncomfortable. It was not the last time that something strange was reported from the remote reaches of the Grand Canyon. It was not even close to the last time. Let us step back from 1909 for a moment and approach the canyon from a different direction entirely. Because even if you set aside the Kincaid account completely, even if you treat it as fiction, as a newspaper tall tale with no basis in fact, the Grand Canyon is still home to documented mysteries that no mainstream explanation has satisfactorily resolved. Start with something simple. Start with scale. The Grand Canyon is enormous. We have established that. But its enormity has an implication that is not always fully appreciated. Much of it has never been properly explored. The side canyons alone, the hundreds of tributary gorges that branch off the main chasm like veins from an artery, represent thousands of miles of terrain that has been visited, in some cases, by only a handful of human beings in the entire modern era. In some remote forks and box canyons, it is entirely plausible that a significant archaeological site could exist without any professional researcher having ever set eyes on it. The canyon's walls are riddled with caves, hundreds of them, thousands, possibly. Most are inaccessible without technical climbing equipment. Many open onto ledges hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, with no obvious approach from below. The canyon's human inhabitants, both ancient and recent, have long known that these high cave systems represent some of the least disturbed spaces on the continent. And archaeologists who have managed to access some of these caves have found things inside them. Not Egyptian hieroglyphs, not seated Buddha statues, but real, documented, legitimate archaeological finds that in their own way are nearly as strange and nearly as difficult to fit into the conventional story. In 1934, a team of archaeologists, working in the canyon's more remote western reaches, found a cache of split-twig figurines in a cave high on a canyon wall. The figurines were tiny animals, mostly deer and bighorn sheep, twisted from single willow twigs in a way that required considerable dexterity and knowledge of the material. Carbon dating, when it became available, placed these figurines at approximately 4,000 years old. That is not particularly surprising. 4,000 years ago, people lived in the canyon. We know that. What was surprising was that the figurines had been deliberately impaled with tiny spears or placed in positions suggesting hunting magic or ritualistic use, and they had been intentionally hidden. Wedged into crevices in the back of the cave, sealed beneath flat stones, placed where no one passing by would see them. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal these objects, to preserve them, to make them secret. Who hid them? Why? What were they for? The split-twig figurines are real. They are in museum collections. You can look them up. And more than 80 years after their discovery, the questions they raise remain only partially answered. But the split-twig figurines are just the beginning, because the deeper you go into the canyon's documented archaeological record, the stranger things get. The canyon has been inhabited, off and on, for at least 12,000 years. That is the number that the evidence currently supports, though some researchers believe the actual occupation may extend considerably further back. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the first people arrived in the region. We know this from their stone tools, simple but effective blades and scrapers and points left behind in cave floors and on exposed canyon terraces. These earliest inhabitants are lumped together under the term Paleo-Indians, a catch-all category for the first Americans, people who crossed into the continent from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge when Ice Age sea levels were low enough to create a walkable path between continents. That is the official story. That is the mainstream consensus. Humans came from Asia. They crossed the land bridge. They spread south and east. They populated the Americas over thousands of years. The canyon's earliest inhabitants were among their descendants. It is a tidy story. It is supported by substantial evidence, and it has been under serious challenge for decades. Because the Bering Land Bridge theory, solid as it is in its broad outlines, does not explain everything. It does not explain the genetic signatures found in some South American indigenous populations that look more like the genetic signatures of ancient Australians than like those of Northeast Asian populations. It does not explain the presence of linguistic structures in some American languages that have no clear parallels anywhere in Asia. It does not explain the cultural practices, the iconographic traditions, the architectural knowledge that appear in some early American sites in forms that seem to have no obvious Asian antecedent, and it does not explain certain things found in and around the Grand Canyon specifically. In the 1970s, an archaeologist working in the canyon's Marble Canyon section, the northeastern approach to the main canyon, found something that generated significant internal discussion among professional archaeologists and almost no public attention whatsoever. He found a hearth, a fire pit, with charcoal and burnt bone surrounding it. In a location that stratigraphy, the analysis of the rock layers surrounding the find, placed well below what should have been the earliest human occupation layer, not slightly below, significantly below. The charcoal was submitted for radiocarbon dating. The results came back, and the dates were uncomfortable, not impossible, not some wild order of magnitude departure from the established timeline, but old enough to raise serious questions about when exactly people first arrived in this part of North America, old enough that the lead archaeologist filed his report with the appropriate institutional authorities, and then, largely, moved on to other work. The report was published, in the narrow sense that it entered the archaeological literature, but it did not generate the public conversation it perhaps should have. This is not unusual in archaeology. The field has a complicated relationship with finds that challenge the established timeline. Not a conspiracy, nothing so dramatic or organized as that, but a kind of institutional conservatism, a preference for interpretations that fit comfortably within the existing framework, a tendency to treat anomalous finds with extra skepticism and to require a higher standard of evidence for conclusions that overturn established consensus than for conclusions that support it. This is in some ways good scientific practice. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But it can also mean that genuinely significant discoveries get quietly filed away rather than vigorously pursued. And in the case of the Grand Canyon, there have been a great many quietly filed discoveries. Consider the ancestral Puebloans, the people formerly known as the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning roughly the ancient ones or the ancient enemy, depending on translation. These were the people who built the extraordinary cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde in Colorado, the great houses of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the hundreds of stone villages scattered across the Colorado Plateau in a region that encompasses parts of 4 modern American states. They were sophisticated architects, skilled farmers, accomplished astronomers, and long-distance traders. Their roads, built without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, stretched for hundreds of miles in dead straight lines across the desert landscape. Their buildings were oriented to capture specific astronomical events with a precision that would be impressive in any era. The ancestral Puebloans occupied the Grand Canyon region from roughly 2,000 years ago until somewhere around 1300 AD, when they largely abandoned their settlements and migrated south and east, their descendants becoming the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. Their presence in the canyon is well documented. Their dwellings, granaries, petroglyphs, and kivas, the sacred underground ceremonial chambers that are a defining feature of Puebloan culture, have been found throughout the canyon in large numbers. But scattered among the genuinely ancestral Puebloan sites are things that do not fit the ancestral Puebloan cultural pattern, things that appear older, or that show influences that have no obvious source in the local cultural sequence, things that have prompted quiet, intense debates among the relatively small community of archaeologists who specialize in this region. One category of anomaly involves the kivas themselves. The kiva is a distinctive structure, circular or rectangular, partially or fully subterranean, entered through a hole in the roof by means of a ladder with a ventilation shaft, a fire pit, a deflector stone to direct air over the fire, a sipapu, a small hole in the floor representing the entrance to the underworld from which the ancestors emerged. The design is specific. The symbolism is specific. It is one of the most recognizable and consistent architectural forms in all of North American prehistory. But in certain locations in the Grand Canyon's more remote tributary canyons, archaeologists have found kiva-like structures that do not follow the standard ancestral Puebloan form. They are larger than typical kivas. Their proportions are different. Their construction techniques use stone-fitting methods that are more sophisticated than the norm for the region and period. And some of them are oriented in ways that do not correspond to the astronomical alignments typical of ancestral Puebloan ceremonial architecture. They are pointed at something else, something that nobody has yet convincingly identified. Who built them? Were they earlier than the standard ancestral Puebloan sequence? Were they built by a different group that interacted with the ancestral Puebloans? Were they something that the ancestral Puebloans built in deliberate imitation of something they had encountered or been taught or inherited as tradition from an earlier culture? None of these questions has been definitively answered. And in a region as remote and as incompletely explored as the Grand Canyon, the answers may not be accessible without a level of systematic archaeological effort that has not yet been mounted. There is another category of anomaly that deserves attention. It involves water. Water in the desert is not just a resource, it is the organizing principle of civilization. Where water exists, people settle. Where water disappears, people move. The history of human occupation in the Grand Canyon is fundamentally a history of water management, of understanding the seasonal rhythms of the Colorado River and its tributaries, of building check dams and irrigation channels to capture and control the precious moisture that made agriculture possible in this arid landscape. The ancestral Puebloans were skilled hydraulic engineers. Their check dams, small walls built across seasonal stream channels to slow runoff and allow it to percolate into the soil, are found throughout the canyon in large numbers. Their irrigation systems fed terraced gardens on canyon ledges that would have been extraordinarily difficult to farm. They understood their water, But in certain locations, archaeologists have found hydraulic structures that appear to predate the ancestral Puebloan occupation, that are built to a different standard and on a different scale, and that demonstrate a knowledge of water flow and terrain that is, frankly, ahead of what we would expect from any culture we can confidently place in the Grand Canyon at the time they appear to have been built. In one tributary canyon in the western section of the park, there is a series of interconnected pools carved directly into the bedrock, connected by channels that slope at precise angles calculated to move water at a controlled rate from one pool to the next. The carvings are not natural. They are too regular, too deliberate, too functionally sophisticated to be explained by erosion. They were made by hands that understood fluid dynamics in a practical sense that rivaled the engineering knowledge of many better documented ancient civilizations. The dating of these features is difficult. Rock carvings cannot be directly dated by radiocarbon methods. The patina, the weathering on the carved surfaces, is consistent with extreme age. But patina formation rates vary enough that a precise date is impossible to establish from surface examination alone. What can be said is that the carvings are old. How old is a question that remains genuinely open. And this is the pattern that repeats, again and again, throughout the canyon's archaeological record. Not the dramatic, unambiguous evidence of some lost civilization with Egyptian connections that the 1909 Gazette story seemed to promise. Not the smoking gun of a sealed chamber full of artifacts that would single-handedly overturn the conventional history of the Americas. Instead, something subtler, more pervasive, and in its own way, more unsettling. A persistent collection of things that do not quite fit. Things that are slightly too old, or in the wrong style, or oriented the wrong way, or built to a higher standard than the known cultural sequence of the region would predict. Things that, individually, can be explained away, assigned to error or misidentification, or the acknowledged incompleteness of the archaeological record, but that, taken together, begin to suggest that the story of human occupation in the Grand Canyon is more complex, more layered, and more mysterious than the textbooks have been willing to admit. Let us talk about the Colorado River itself for a moment, because the river is central to everything. The Colorado drains approximately 246,000 square miles of western North America, a watershed that encompasses parts of 7 American states and 2 Mexican states. It is one of the great rivers of the continent, and for most of human prehistory, it was also one of the great barriers, a deep, swift, cold current carving its way through one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth. Getting across it, getting down to it, getting up from it, all of these were significant engineering challenges that occupied the minds of every culture that sought to use the canyon. And yet the river was also a highway. People traveled by water. Boats, rafts, logs, inflated animal skins. The evidence for watercraft use in the canyon is sparse, but it exists. Stone artifacts found on canyon ledges reachable only from the water have been dated to periods when the only logical means of access would have been the river. Certain pictographs, painted images on canyon walls, appear to show boats or watercraft of forms that have no obvious parallel in the known material culture of any southwestern people. One series of pictographs in a side canyon off the main gorge has been the subject of intense amateur interest and occasional professional attention for decades. The images show figures in what appear to be enclosed vessels, with lines extending from the vessels that some interpret as oars or paddles. The style of the painting is unlike anything in the established repertoire of ancestral Puebloan or earlier archaic period rock art. The pigments appear to be old, though again, precise dating of pictographs is methodologically difficult. The location of the images, on a wall accessible only from the river at a specific water level, suggests they were made by people traveling the river rather than by people living on the canyon walls above. Who were they? Where were they going? Where had they come from? The pictographs do not tell us. They simply insist, in their mute, painted way, that someone was here, in this remote and forbidding place, in a boat, at some point in the deep past, and that they wanted to leave a mark of their presence. The impulse is entirely human. It is the same impulse that drove the Ice Age painters to press their hands against cave walls in France and Spain 35,000 years ago, to make those famous hand stencils that survive as ghostly evidence of individual lives. I was here. I existed. I passed this way. In the Grand Canyon, someone passed this way, and we do not know who they were. Now let us return to the question of Egyptian influence, not because the evidence for it is strong, but because the question itself is interesting, and the reasons it keeps surfacing are worth examining. The claim that ancient Egyptians visited, or even colonized, North America is one that mainstream archaeologists treat with complete dismissal, and for good reason. The evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas is a subject of legitimate scholarly debate, but most of that debate focuses on Norse contact in the North Atlantic, on possible Polynesian contact with South America, on theoretical Pacific crossings that might explain certain shared cultural elements between Asian and American civilizations. Egyptian contact with North America, specifically with the American Southwest, is not a position that any credentialed archaeologist whose work is taken seriously has advanced in the past century. And yet the claim keeps appearing. It appeared in the 1909 Gazette article, with its references to hieroglyphs and Buddha-like figurines. It appeared in subsequent reports from amateur explorers who visited the canyon in the decades that followed. It appears today in a robust internet literature that blends genuine archaeological anomalies with speculative interpretation and, occasionally, outright fabrication. Why does it keep appearing? What is it about the Grand Canyon specifically that generates this particular obsession? Part of the answer is probably psychological. The canyon is so grand, so ancient, so clearly older than any human civilization that the mind reaches for the grandest explanations. The ancient Egyptians, in popular imagination, represent the ultimate in ancient mystery. They built the pyramids, they mummified their dead. They left hieroglyphs that waited thousands of years to be decoded. They are the archetype of the lost civilization, the builders of things so impressive that future generations would struggle to believe mere human beings had made them. Connecting the Grand Canyon to Egypt is, on some level, an attempt to match the canyon's scale with an equally impressive human story. Part of the answer is genuine geographical coincidence. Certain sections of the Grand Canyon were named by early American geographers and explorers with Egyptian and other Old World names. There is a region called Egyptian Garden. There is a tower called Isis Temple. There is a promontory called Osiris Temple. There is a tower called Tower of Ra, a natural butte called Cheops Pyramid. These names were applied by Clarence Dutton, a geologist working for the United States Geological Survey in the 1870s and 1880s, who had a romantic literary sensibility and a habit of naming the canyon's natural formations after the grandest cultural references he could think of. Egyptian, Hindu, Norse, Greek. He used them all, and the names stuck. This is the prosaic explanation. The geographical names on the canyon's map are not evidence of ancient Egyptian presence. They are evidence that Clarence Dutton liked dramatic names. But the coincidence between the Egyptian-themed geography and the Egyptian-themed claims of the 1909 Gazette story has been irresistible to certain kinds of readers who have interpreted the naming as somehow meaningful, as a clue, as evidence that the first American explorers of the region knew or suspected something about the canyon's connection to the ancient world. They did not. Dutton was a geologist, not a mystic. His naming conventions reflected Victorian literary fashion, not secret archaeological knowledge. And yet, and this is the genuinely uncomfortable part, setting aside the Egyptian connection entirely, still leaves the real anomalies. The anomalies that predate the 1909 article. The anomalies that have nothing to do with hieroglyphs, or mummies, or Smithsonian cover-ups. The anomalies that are documented in legitimate archaeological literature and that have never been fully explained. Those anomalies are real, and they deserve serious attention. Let us talk about Stanton's Cave. In 1969, a team of archaeologists from the Museum of Northern Arizona conducted a systematic survey of caves in the Marble Canyon section of the Grand Canyon, the narrow upstream portion of the canyon before it widens into the main gorge. One of the caves they examined was Stanton's Cave, named for Robert Brewster Stanton, a railway engineer who had sheltered in it during an early river expedition in 1889. The cave sits well above the modern river level accessible from the water during extreme high water events, but effectively landlocked under normal conditions. It is large enough to have served as a shelter, and there was evidence that it had been used repeatedly over a long period of time. What the 1969 survey team found inside Stanton's cave was significant and, on one count, extraordinary. The significant finds were exactly what you might expect. Stone tools, animal bones with butchering marks, the remains of fires, evidence of repeated human occupation reaching back several thousand years. Consistent with what was already known about human presence in the canyon, the extraordinary find was a collection of animal bones that did not fit. Bones of species that should not have been present in the canyon at any point during documented human occupation. Bones of animals that had been extinct in North America for 10,000 years. Bones of the horse. Bones of species that belonged to the Pleistocene megafauna, the great animals of the Ice Age that vanished from North America at the end of the last glacial period, some 12,000 years ago. These bones were not isolated finds. They were not intrusive deposits, bones that had washed into the cave from an earlier deposit elsewhere. They were in situ, in their original position, in a context that associated them with the other material found in the cave. And some of them bore evidence of human processing, cut marks, the characteristic traces of stone tool butchery. The implications were significant. If humans were butchering horses and other Pleistocene megafauna in Stanton's cave, they were present in the Grand Canyon before or during the extinction of those animals, which would push human occupation of the canyon back to at least 12,000 years ago and possibly further. Not impossibly far, not wildly at odds with the broader evidence for early human arrival in North America, but earlier than the conventional story for this specific region, and possibly indicating that early humans in the Grand Canyon were contributing to the extinction of those great Pleistocene animals, hunting them to oblivion along with the changing climate. The Stanton's cave finds were published. They entered the academic literature. They were debated, analyzed, disputed, and partially accepted. They are not a secret. But they are also not well known outside the community of specialists who work on North American prehistory, and they represent precisely the kind of documented archaeological find that suggests the conventional timeline of human occupation in the Grand Canyon is, at minimum, incomplete. But Stanton's cave is not the strangest thing in the canyon's documented record. Not even close. To find the strangest documented thing, we need to go to a site called the Marble Canyon Pictograph Panel, a series of rock paintings on a cliff face overlooking the river in the canyon's upper section. The pictographs are genuine. They have been professionally documented. They are in the published scientific literature, and they include, among more conventional elements, a series of images that have prompted genuinely puzzled responses from researchers who have examined them. The images show human or humanoid figures. This is normal. The canyon is full of pictograph panels showing human figures. What is not normal is what these particular figures are wearing, or more precisely, what they appear to be wearing. They are depicted in what looks, unmistakably, like full-body enclosures. Suits, garments that cover the entire body from head to foot, with rounded helmet-like head coverings, and features that suggest sealed garments rather than simple clothing. Now, there are conventional explanations for this. Shamanic iconography is rich with depictions of figures in animal costumes, in masks, in elaborate ceremonial garments. The rounded forms might represent ceremonial headdresses. The sealed appearance might be an artistic convention for depicting a figure in a specific ritual state. The entire panel might represent a vision, a dream, a journey to another world, rather than a literal depiction of something the artist had actually seen. These explanations are reasonable. They are, probably, correct. And yet the images are disturbing in their specificity, in the way they insist on depicting something enclosed, contained, sealed in a manner that the other human figures on canyon walls around the region do not appear to be. And when you place those images alongside the other anomalies of the Grand Canyon's archaeological record, they become part of a pattern that refuses to resolve into comfortable simplicity. A pattern of things that are almost explained, almost accounted for, almost fitting into the known story, but not quite. It is time to talk about the Havasupai. The Havasupai people have lived in the Grand Canyon, and on the surrounding plateaus for centuries, possibly for millennia, depending on how you trace the complex population movements and cultural continuities of the southwestern archaeological sequence. Their name translates to people of the blue-green water, a reference to the extraordinary turquoise waterfalls that flow through Havasu Canyon, a tributary of the main gorge. They are, today, a federally recognized tribe with a reservation in the canyon, and they are the only year-round human residents of the Grand Canyon. The Havasupai have oral traditions that go back far beyond the reach of any written record. They have stories about the canyon that their elders have passed down through generations, stories about what the canyon is and what it contains and what it means. And some of those stories, when they have been shared with outside researchers, have raised questions that go well beyond the standard domain of cultural anthropology. The Havasupai have traditions that speak of beings, not people in any conventional sense, but beings associated with specific locations in the canyon, with particular caves and crevices and high remote alcoves, beings who were present in the canyon before the Havasupai themselves, before any people the Havasupai know of in their own history. Beings connected to the stone of the canyon walls in a way that is not metaphorical but quite literal, as though they are part of the rock, as though the rock itself remembers them. This is, of course, spiritual and mythological language. Every indigenous people on Earth has traditions about beings from before human time, about ancestors or spirits who shaped the landscape. The Havasupai traditions are not unusual in that broad, structural sense. What is unusual is the consistency with which those traditions point to specific physical locations, specific caves, specific passages, specific features of the canyon geology that, in some cases, have been subsequently investigated by archaeologists who found their things that, while not supernatural in any way, were genuinely anomalous and unexplained. One of the most striking examples involves a series of caves in the canyon's remote western section that Havasupai tradition identifies as places of power, places where the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever lies beneath or beyond it is thin. The elders, when they have described these locations to researchers, have mentioned passages that go far back into the cliff, chambers that open up beyond the initial entrance, the sense of space beyond the small opening visible from outside. Archaeologists who have been permitted to investigate some of these sites have found, in several cases, exactly that. Cave systems that extend considerably further into the rock than the exterior appearance would suggest. Chambers that open up past narrow entrance passages. In at least one case, evidence of occupation and use by humans at a depth into the cliff that would have required the knowledge of the passage's full extent, suggesting that whoever used the site had previously explored it and understood its layout. Was this the society described in the 1909 newspaper story? Almost certainly not in the specific dramatic terms of that account. But is there something real at the heart of the Havasupai traditions? Something grounded in actual features of the actual canyon, actual spaces within the rock that have been known to indigenous people for generations and that have not yet been fully described to or by the outside scientific community? That question, too, remains genuinely open. Now let us talk about uranium. This might seem like a sharp and jarring pivot, but stay with it, because the uranium story connects directly to the question of what the canyon contains and who knew about it and when. The Grand Canyon sits atop significant uranium deposits. This has been known since the early 20th century. The canyon's Kaibab limestone and other formations contain uranium ores that were commercially mined at various points during the 20th century, most intensively during the Cold War period, when the United States government was buying uranium for its nuclear weapons program. The most significant mining operation in the canyon was the Orphan Mine on the South Rim, which operated from the 1950s through the 1960s and extracted ore from a pipe of breccia, fractured rock, that extended nearly 1,000 feet down into the canyon wall. The Orphan Mine and several smaller operations were eventually shut down, and the Grand Canyon region has been the subject of ongoing controversy about proposals for new uranium mining that would, critics argue, threaten the canyon's water supply and ecological integrity. But here is the detail that is rarely mentioned in the uranium mining debates. Evidence exists suggesting that pre-Columbian people in the canyon region were aware of the uranium deposits, not because they understood uranium chemistry or radioactivity, But because the ore body has certain visible characteristics, a distinctive staining of the surrounding rock, a yellow-green color from the oxidized uranium minerals that ancient miners recognized as markers for metal-bearing rock. Pre-Columbian copper mines in the American Southwest are well documented. Copper was a prestige material used for tools and ornaments and trade goods, and indigenous people developed sophisticated techniques for finding and extracting it. The visual markers for copper ore are similar in some ways to the markers for uranium ore, and in a region where both exist, it would not be surprising if ancient miners encountered uranium ore while looking for copper, recognized the distinctive coloration, and began investigating. Whether they did anything useful with what they found is another question. Uranium ore, in its natural form, is of limited utility without the knowledge of modern chemistry. But evidence at certain pre-Columbian sites in the canyon region includes occasional pieces of uranium mineral, pieces that have been shaped or worked in ways consistent with deliberate collection, not accidental inclusion. This is not evidence of ancient nuclear technology. Let that be absolutely clear. But it is evidence that some pre-Columbian people in the canyon were collecting uranium ore for reasons we do not fully understand, which raises questions about the full range of materials and resources that the canyon was providing to its ancient inhabitants, and about the sophistication with which those inhabitants were exploring and exploiting their geological environment. Some researchers who have worked at the intersection of archaeology and geology in the canyon region have suggested that certain features of the landscape, including some of the caves and passages that have attracted attention for other reasons, may have been initially discovered and accessed specifically in the course of mineral prospecting, of people working through the canyon walls in search of usable materials. On this view, the complex of passages and chambers described by Kincaid in 1909, if it existed at all, would not be a mysterious temple constructed for unknown religious purposes, but the remnant of an ancient industrial operation, a mine that had been worked for generations, with the side chambers and storage areas accumulating over time as the mine expanded. The mummies and artifacts in this scenario would be the remains of the miners and their equipment, not the treasures of a lost civilization. It is not a romantic interpretation, but it is a more archaeologically plausible one than most of the alternatives. And it would explain certain features of the reported site that otherwise seem strange, including the long straight main corridor, which is much more characteristic of a mine adit than of a temple or tomb, and the side chambers opening off it at regular intervals, which correspond precisely to the pattern of storage and processing chambers in mining operations of comparable complexity from other parts of the ancient world. Whether this is what the 1909 discovery actually represented, whether there even was a discovery in 1909, these are questions that cannot be answered without access to the site. And the site, if it exists, remains inaccessible. The National Park Service, which administers the Grand Canyon, restricts access to many portions of the canyon's backcountry, both for ecological and archaeological preservation reasons and for safety reasons. The canyon is genuinely dangerous. People die in it every year. The sections of the canyon wall that are technically accessible only with specialized climbing equipment are effectively off-limits to casual investigation, and obtaining permits for serious archaeological investigation of specific sites requires institutional affiliation, funding, and a research plan approved by the Park Service and by federal and tribal authorities. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal administrative apparatus for managing a sensitive and irreplaceable natural and cultural resource. But it has the practical effect of making systematic investigation of many of the canyon's most interesting and anomalous sites extremely difficult. Some researchers have argued that this difficulty is not entirely coincidental, that the Park Service's management of backcountry access has, over the decades, functionally protected certain areas from the kind of investigation that might either confirm or definitively debunk the various claims and reports that have accumulated around them. This is a charge that the Park Service would vigorously deny, and there is no evidence that it reflects any deliberate policy. But the fact remains that the Grand Canyon's most remote and inaccessible locations remain very remote and very inaccessible, and that the archaeological investigation of those locations is not proceeding at any speed that would satisfy those who believe the canyon contains secrets worth finding. Let us take a different approach for a moment and think about what the canyon would need to contain in order for any of the more dramatic theories to have any substance. If the Grand Canyon really does contain architectural remains of a civilization significantly more advanced than the known pre-Columbian cultures of the American Southwest, certain things would follow necessarily. First, there would need to be materials. Not wood, which would not survive even in the dry canyon environment over the timescales required, but stone, ceramic, metal. And if those materials existed in the quantities required for a significant architectural complex, they could not have been entirely removed by a single expedition in the early 20th century. Archaeology does not work that way. Artifacts left behind in remote desert environments survive for extraordinarily long periods. If the Kincaid Cavern was real and contained what the newspaper account claimed, there should be residual evidence of it. Stone chips from tool manufacture, fragments of pottery, stains in the floor deposit from the decay of organic materials, the chemical signatures of fire use. These things do not disappear. They might be covered. They might be difficult to access, but they would be there. And the fact that no subsequent expedition by any of the various groups of enthusiasts and amateur investigators who have attempted to locate the site over the past century has found any such residual evidence is, genuinely, a problem for the theory of a real discovery in 1909. It does not conclusively disprove it. The canyon is vast. The accounts of the site's location are vague. The access problems are real. It is entirely possible that a motivated and well-equipped expedition with modern GPS technology and technical climbing capability could locate a site that earlier investigators simply could not find. The canyon has kept secrets for 12,000 years. It is not giving them up easily. But the absence of any confirmation, after more than a century of determined searching, is significant. It is the kind of absence that, in the absence of other evidence, would incline most reasonable people toward the skeptical interpretation. And yet, there are the other anomalies. The split-twig figurines, the Stanton's Cave megafauna bones, the Marble Canyon pictographs, the hydraulic engineering, the unusual kivas, the Havasupai traditions. These things are real, they are documented, and they collectively suggest that the Grand Canyon's pre-Columbian history is not the simple, well-understood story that the textbooks imply. Something happened here. Something has been happening here for a very long time, and we do not have anything close to a complete understanding of what it was. Let us talk about Kolb's studio. Ellsworth and Emery Kolb were brothers and photographers who settled at the south rim of the Grand Canyon in the early 20th century and spent decades documenting the canyon in images of extraordinary quality. Their studio, built at the canyon rim, is still standing and is a beloved historical landmark. Their photographs, taken on expeditions that took them to corners of the canyon that most professional archaeologists of their era never visited, provide a remarkable visual record of the canyon's features as they appeared a century ago. Among the thousands of photographs the Kolb brothers took during their years of canyon exploration are a number of images that have attracted attention from researchers interested in the canyon's anomalies. The brothers photographed cave openings on canyon walls that are not easily accessible by trail. They photographed natural formations in certain tributary canyons that show what might be interpreted as artificial modification. They photographed rock art panels in locations that were, at the time, virtually unknown outside the local indigenous community. One series of Kolb photographs shows a section of canyon wall in a remote side canyon that the brothers accessed by a combination of boat travel on the Colorado and technical climbing on the canyon walls. The photographs show a series of cave openings at various heights on the cliff face, some of them with what the brothers described in their expedition notes as evidence of construction, apparent stone walls, or blocking structures at the cave entrances. These were not the caves of the 1909 newspaper story. They were in a different location. But they show the same general phenomenon, constructed or modified cave systems in remote, inaccessible canyon locations that has been reported by multiple independent observers across more than a century of canyon exploration. The Kolb photographs are archived at the Klein Library at Northern Arizona University. They have been examined by researchers. Some of what the brothers photographed has been identified, analyzed, and assigned to known pre-Columbian cultures. Some of it has not. Some of the features they documented in their expedition notes remain unexcavated, unexplained, and off-limits to casual investigation. What is in those unexcavated, unexplained sites? The honest answer is that we do not know. They might contain nothing of significance, just the normal accumulation of ancient habitation debris that archaeologists find at most prehistoric sites. Or they might contain something more interesting, more anomalous, more challenging to the standard story. We do not know because we have not looked carefully enough. Now let us consider the question of the canyon's geological mysteries, because the physical structure of the canyon itself contains puzzles that are, in their own way, as interesting as any archaeological find. The Grand Canyon was carved by the Colorado River over a period that geologists have traditionally estimated at 5 to 6 million years. This estimate is based on dating the canyon's formation relative to the tilting of the Colorado Plateau and the establishment of the river's current course toward the Gulf of California. For most of the 20th century, this estimate was considered settled science. In 2012, it was thrown into significant doubt. A study, published in the journal Science, led by a team of researchers from the University of Colorado, used a dating technique called uranium lead thermochronology to analyze the mineral grains in samples taken from deep within the canyon. The technique measures the rate at which uranium in mineral grains decays into lead and can be used to determine when those grains last experienced significant heating, which in turn allows inference about when they were last buried at significant depth. The results were startling. The Colorado Plateau cooling signatures in those deep canyon samples suggested that the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, the deepest, oldest portion of the canyon, had been excavated not 5 to 6 million years ago, as the standard story held, but somewhere between 60 and 70 million years ago, making the deepest part of the canyon roughly 12 times older than had been believed. This was not universally accepted. Other researchers criticized the methodology and the interpretation of the data. The debate about the canyon's age, which had been essentially settled for decades, was suddenly wide open again. The implications, if the older date is correct, are significant for more than just geology. A canyon that has existed in some form for 60 to 70 million years is a canyon that has been a feature of the North American landscape for the entire period of mammalian evolution on this continent. It was there when the first horses evolved in North America. It was there when the ancestors of modern humans were still ape-like creatures in Africa. It is not just a geological feature, but a presence, a physical reality that has shaped the ecology and geography of Western North America since before there were any large mammals of any kind on the continent. And it raises an interesting question about the canyon's significance to human populations, not just the relatively recent populations of the past 12,000 years, but potentially to much older populations, if any such populations ever reached the Americas. The evidence for pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas, for people arriving before the generally accepted 13,000 years ago, is thin but not non-existent. There are sites, disputed sites, claimed sites, sites where the evidence is ambiguous enough to support interpretation in multiple directions. Most of these claims have not withstood rigorous scrutiny. Some have. Could the Grand Canyon, in its deepest and most inaccessible sections, contain evidence of human presence that predates the currently accepted timeline by a significant margin, not by millions of years? Human beings have only existed for approximately 300,000 years, and the canyon, in its current general form, has only been accessible to land-based animals for the last several million years. But there are well-documented cases in North America of human remains and artifacts that appear to date earlier than 13,000 years, and the canyon's combination of extreme antiquity, extreme inaccessibility, and extreme preservation conditions make it, theoretically, exactly the kind of place where such evidence might survive. No such evidence has been formally reported, but the systematic deep archaeology investigation of the Grand Canyon has never been conducted with the kind of resources and access that would make such a survey definitive. The canyon remains, in significant portions, incompletely examined. There is another geological puzzle worth discussing here, one that involves the canyon's springs. The Grand Canyon has hundreds of springs, places where groundwater from the plateaus above emerges from the canyon walls, sometimes in dramatic cascades, like the famous Havasupai Falls, sometimes in modest seeps that sustain tiny isolated ecosystems in otherwise bare desert rock. The springs are the key to human habitation in the canyon. Wherever there is a reliable spring, there is evidence of ancient occupation. The springs were the organizing principle of canyon life. Some of the canyon's springs have unusual chemistry. Their water is exceptionally pure, or is laden with minerals in unexpected combinations, or shows temperature anomalies, suggesting connections to geothermal systems deep in the earth. Some of the springs emerge from locations that geologists have been unable to fully account for, places where the surface hydrology of the plateau above does not obviously connect to the subsurface drainage that feeds the spring. This is not mysterious in any dramatic sense. The hydrology of porous limestone is complex and can route water through unexpected paths over considerable distances. But it does mean that the full picture of how water moves through the Grand Canyon's subsurface is not known. And it means that cave systems fed by this subsurface water might extend further and in more unexpected directions than surface observation would suggest. The connection between unusual spring chemistry, subsurface water movement, and deep cave systems is not just speculative. At Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, a cave system of extraordinary size and complexity was carved not by the downward erosion of surface water, but by the upward migration of sulfuric acid produced by the interaction of subsurface water with hydrogen sulfide gas. The result was a cave network that formed from the inside out, with passages and chambers of a scale and regularity that would have seemed impossible to form by surface erosion alone. The Grand Canyon's geology is different from Carlsbad's in many ways, but the same general principle applies. Cave formation in limestone and other soluble rocks can proceed by mechanisms that are not obvious from surface examination and can produce results that are not predictable from the known surface hydrology. Deep, complex cave systems can and do exist in places where the surface gives little indication of their presence. The canyon has been surveyed, but not comprehensively. The surface has been mapped, but the subsurface is largely unknown. And the subsurface, in a geological formation as ancient, as complex, and as hydrologically active as the Grand Canyon, could contain spaces of considerable size and extent that have never been entered by any human being, or that were entered long ago and have since been inaccessible. Let us now talk about the river of documentation, because whatever lies in the physical canyon, the documentary record surrounding the canyon's mysteries is itself a remarkable artifact. The Smithsonian Institution has, over its history, received thousands of reports of unusual archaeological finds from amateur investigators, professional explorers, and ordinary people who stumbled across something unexpected. The vast majority of these reports turn out to be explainable by reference to known cultures and known archaeological processes. Some turn out to be hoaxes or misidentifications. A small number remain genuinely unclear. The institutional management of this flow of reports is a legitimate area of scholarly inquiry, not because there is any particular reason to believe the Smithsonian is engaged in a coordinated campaign of suppression, but because the decisions made by major cultural institutions about what to investigate, what to display, what to archive, and what to quietly set aside have real consequences for the public understanding of history. An institution that systematically under-investigates certain categories of find, not because of conspiracy, but simply because those finds do not fit the categories that institutional programs are designed to handle, can end up with a body of unexamined material that, taken together, represents a significant gap in the historical record. The Smithsonian's collections are vast beyond easy comprehension. The institution holds approximately 150 million objects, specimens, and documents distributed across 19 museums, 21 libraries, 9 research centers, and numerous other facilities. The resources required to properly catalogue, analyze, and describe the entire collection are not available. Significant portions of the collection are not fully documented. Some objects have lost their provenance records. Some finds from early expeditions are simply labeled with the general area of collection and nothing more specific. In this environment, it is entirely plausible that significant archaeological materials from the Grand Canyon region could exist in the Smithsonian's collections without being readily identifiable as such. Not hidden, not suppressed, just lost in the overwhelming scale of institutional accumulation, waiting for someone to notice them. Researchers who have attempted systematic investigation of the Smithsonian's records relating to the Grand Canyon have generally found what you would expect, given that description. Some materials from the region, clearly documented. Some references to expeditions and finds that cannot be fully traced. Some gaps that might mean nothing and might mean a great deal. The record is incomplete in ways that are frustrating but probably not sinister. The 1909 Gazette story, specifically, has been the subject of considerable searching in the Smithsonian archives. Researchers have looked for any record of a S.A. Jordan, or of a Kincaid, or of any expedition to the Grand Canyon matching the one described. They have found nothing, which could mean the story was fabricated, or it could mean that whatever records existed were never properly entered into the institutional system, which, in 1909, was considerably less comprehensive than it is today. The absence of records from 115 years ago does not tell us very much. What we know, with confidence, is that the Smithsonian has no publicly accessible documentation of the 1909 discovery. What we do not know, and cannot know without unrestricted access to the institution's complete archive, is whether any such documentation ever existed. That is an unsatisfying conclusion. It is also the honest one. Let us now broaden our scope considerably and think about the Grand Canyon in the context of the broader question of pre-Columbian American civilization. For most of the 20th century, the dominant narrative of American prehistory was essentially this. People arrived from Asia about 13,000 years ago. They spread across the Americas. They developed agriculture and settled civilizations in a handful of locations, most notably in Mesoamerica and in the Andes, while remaining at relatively simple levels of social organization in most of North America. When Europeans arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they encountered a continent that was sparsely populated, lightly developed, and essentially primitive by Old World standards. This narrative is now recognized by most serious scholars as wrong in important respects. Recent estimates of the pre-Columbian population of the Americas run considerably higher than the figures that were accepted for most of the 20th century. Some researchers believe the Americas were home to 50 million people or more in 1491, a figure that would make the population collapse, caused by European diseases, among the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The sophistication of pre-Columbian agricultural systems, especially in the Amazon basin, has been fundamentally reassessed in recent decades with the discovery of the dark, fertile soils called terra preta, which appear to be the product of deliberate soil improvement by pre-Columbian farmers over centuries. The complexity of pre-Columbian North American political organization, exemplified by the Mississippian culture and the great ceremonial city of Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, has been recognized as far greater than the old narratives allowed. In this context of systematic reassessment, the possibility that the pre-Columbian history of the Grand Canyon region contains surprises that do not fit the old framework looks considerably less exotic than it might have seemed a generation ago. The question is not whether the Grand Canyon contains archaeological mysteries. It clearly does. The question is what kind of mysteries they are. Are they, as the 1909 newspaper story suggested, the remnants of a non-American civilization, Egyptian or otherwise, that somehow found its way to the American Southwest? Or are they something else, the remnants of Native American cultures more sophisticated, more ancient, and more complex than the conventional story has been willing to acknowledge? The second option seems considerably more likely, not because it is less interesting. In many ways, the idea that the first Americans developed a civilization in the Grand Canyon that has been systematically underestimated and underinvestigated is more interesting than the idea that Egyptians got there first. It is more interesting because it is about the people who actually lived here, who were actually part of the long story of human occupation of this landscape, whose descendants are, in some cases, still living in this region today. The Hopi people, whose reservation sits on high mesas northeast of the Grand Canyon, have traditions that place their ancestors in the canyon. They call the canyon Ongtupka, and they regard it as the Sipapu, the place of emergence, the opening through which their ancestors entered this world from the world below. This is not a metaphor to the Hopi. It is not ancient poetry. It is religious geography, a precise cosmological claim about the relationship between this specific physical place and the origin of the Hopi people. The Hopi traditions also include accounts of beings and civilizations that preceded the current world, previous creations that were destroyed and recreated, ancestors who possessed knowledge and capabilities that the current world has lost. These traditions, like all oral traditions, have been shaped by centuries of cultural transmission and cannot be read as literal historical accounts. But they are not nothing. They represent the accumulated cultural memory of a people who have lived in this region for a very long time and who have encoded in their traditions knowledge about this landscape that stretches back further than any written record. What the Hopi remember, in the encoded form of sacred story, about the Grand Canyon and what it contains, is not fully public. Sacred knowledge is, by definition, restricted. What the Hopi are willing to share with outside researchers about their relationship to the canyon and its history does not extend to the most protected inner core of their ceremonial knowledge, and that is entirely their right. But the existence of that protected knowledge, the acknowledged existence within Hopi tradition of things about the canyon that are considered too sacred or too significant to be shared with the outside world, is itself interesting. It is a reminder that the human history of this place extends far deeper than any archaeological excavation has yet been able to reach, and that the people whose ancestors lived here longest may know things about it that science has not yet found. In 2019, a team of researchers from the University of Arizona published a study that generated significant attention in the geological community and somewhat less attention in the popular press. The study used a new analytical technique to re-examine the age of the Grand Canyon's formation, and it arrived at a conclusion that partially reconciled the competing estimates that had been in conflict since the 2012 study. The new research suggested that the canyon's history was more complex than either the old 5 million year estimate or the newer 60 million year estimate could fully account for. The evidence supported what the researchers called a composite canyon, a geological feature that incorporated ancient canyon segments from an earlier erosion cycle into a more recent canyon that formed through a separate and later process. Different parts of the canyon, in other words, had different ages. The deep inner gorge did contain ancient elements consistent with the older estimates. The broader canyon that most visitors see was indeed carved within the last few million years. Both were right, and both were incomplete. This geological complexity, the idea that the Grand Canyon is not one thing with one history, but a layered composite of multiple processes and multiple ages, is a good metaphor for the archaeological complexity of the canyon. It is not one story. It is many stories, layered over each other, some obscuring others, some preserved in conditions that allow partial reconstruction, and some lost completely. The mystery of the Grand Canyon is not the mystery of a single dramatic discovery that changes everything. It is the mystery of a place so vast and so ancient that the full story of what it contains and what happened here can never be completely told. There will always be more cave systems that have not been entered. There will always be rock art panels that have not been fully documented. There will always be layers of the canyon's human history that are too old, too deep, or too inaccessible to have been adequately investigated. The 1909 newspaper story, whether it is true or false, is a symptom of this fundamental condition. The Grand Canyon is a place that invites the imagination to reach beyond what the evidence supports, because the evidence itself is so incomplete that the imagination has enormous room to work. And in that room, people imagine the grandest possible explanations. Egyptian temples, lost civilizations, institutional suppression, the secrets of the ages, the actual truth, the documented, verifiable, peer-reviewed truth, is both more modest and more interesting. The Grand Canyon contains the remains of human occupation going back at least 12,000 years, possibly longer. It contains evidence of cultures and activities that do not fit neatly into the established archaeological sequence. It contains geological features whose age and formation history are still being actively debated. It contains traditions and knowledge held by the indigenous peoples of the region that have not been fully shared with or fully understood by outside researchers. And it contains, in its most remote and inaccessible corners, things that have simply not yet been found. Let us spend some time with a man named John Wesley Powell, because Powell's story is central to the canyon's modern history, and because Powell himself was, in certain respects, a precursor to the kind of anomaly the canyon generates. Powell made his famous river journey through the Grand Canyon in 1869. He lost 3 men. He nearly lost the entire expedition more than once. He emerged from the canyon at the western end, where the canyon walls finally open out and the river enters the Mojave Desert, having completed one of the most audacious feats of exploration in American history. What he wrote about the canyon afterward, in his journals and in his published reports, is interesting not just for its scientific content, but for its emotional and philosophical character. Powell was not a man given to mysticism. He was a geologist, a scientist, a pragmatist who had survived a war and the loss of an arm, and was not inclined toward romantic sentiment about rocks. And yet his writing about the Grand Canyon contains passages of something that borders on awe, on a recognition that this place exists on a scale that exceeds the ordinary categories of human understanding. Powell wrote about the silence of the canyon. He wrote about the sense of time compressed and made visible in its walls. He wrote about looking at the rock layers and feeling that the ordinary sense of human significance was somehow suspended, that standing in the inner gorge and looking up at walls of 2-billion-year-old stone, the affairs of nations and civilizations seemed very small and very recent. This response, the experience of temporal vertigo, the sense that ordinary human time is simply inadequate to account for what the canyon is and what it contains, is one that nearly every serious observer of the canyon has recorded in one form or another. It is what drives the imagination toward the grandest possible interpretations. If something this big and this ancient can exist, surely the human story here must be equally vast, equally complex, equally beyond ordinary accounting. And perhaps it is. The honest assessment is that we do not know. We know more than we did when Powell floated the river in 1869, but we know far less than a place of this significance deserves. The systematic, comprehensive, adequately funded archaeological investigation of the Grand Canyon has not yet happened. The remote portions of the canyon's archaeological record have not been adequately studied. The oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region have not been fully documented or, in many cases, even respectfully solicited. In the meantime, the canyon keeps its secrets. One of the more intriguing threads in the canyon's anomalous history involves a set of artifacts that surfaced in private collections in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Objects that were claimed to have come from the canyon, but whose provenance was never clearly established. These include carved stone tablets, bearing symbols that some researchers identified as resembling, though not exactly matching, Sumerian cuneiform script. Small figurines in styles inconsistent with any known southwestern tradition. Metal objects of ambiguous composition and uncertain origin. Most of these artifacts have been subsequently analyzed and dismissed as either modern forgeries or misidentified objects of known type. The analysis of claimed anomalous artifacts is a well-developed field at this point, and the tools available to modern researchers, X-ray fluorescence, lead isotope analysis, thermoluminescence dating, are sensitive enough to catch most fakes and most misidentifications. Some of the objects in this category, however, have not been subjected to modern analysis. They have disappeared into private collections or into the back rooms of small regional museums, where they sit uninvestigated, catalogued under vague descriptions, waiting for someone to look at them carefully. Not because anyone is hiding them, but simply because the resources and will to systematically examine every anomalous artifact in every regional collection have never existed. This is the prosaic reality of archaeology in America. The scale of the country, the number of sites, the number of artifacts, the number of collections, all vastly outstrip the resources available for their study. Significant things are sitting in cardboard boxes in storage rooms across the country, improperly documented, understood only partially or not at all, their significance unrecognized, because no one with the relevant expertise has had the time to look at them. In the Grand Canyon region specifically, where the pace of archaeological investigation has historically been slow and the access restrictions have limited what can be examined, this problem is particularly acute. There is almost certainly relevant material scattered across the collections of Northern Arizona University, the Museum of Northern Arizona, the Arizona State Museum, the Smithsonian's Southwest Ethnographic Collection, and numerous smaller repositories, material that has not been examined in the context of the broader questions about the canyon's anomalous history. No one is coordinating a comprehensive review. No one has the resources to do so. And so the evidence, whatever it amounts to, remains scattered and incomplete. Let me tell you about something that happened in the 1970s that received almost no public attention at the time and has been largely forgotten since. In 1975, a team of researchers affiliated with the Museum of Northern Arizona was conducting a routine archaeological survey of a section of the Nankoweap Delta, a broad alluvial fan at the confluence of Nankoweap Creek and the Colorado River in the canyon's Marble Canyon section. The Nankoweap area is well known to canyon archaeologists for its remarkable granaries, small stone storage structures built into cliff alcoves high above the river by ancestral Puebloan people around 1,000 years ago. The granaries are one of the more dramatic architectural remains in the canyon and are accessible by a strenuous hike, making them a popular, if demanding, attraction for backcountry visitors. The 1975 survey team was documenting the lower areas of the delta below the granaries, looking for evidence of habitation at the delta's surface level. What they found, buried beneath approximately 2 feet of alluvial sediment deposited by the river over centuries, was a layer of cultural material that was not ancestral Puebloan. The material was fragmentary, sherds of pottery in a style that did not correspond to any known southwestern ceramic tradition. Some stone tools of types associated with early Archaic period occupation rather than the later ancestral Puebloan sequence. Fragments of what appeared to be bone with possible cut marks, though the condition of the material made this difficult to confirm. The team collected samples, filed their survey report, and moved on. The samples were submitted for analysis. The pottery, when examined by ceramic specialists, was indeed anomalous. The style was unlike anything in the established typological sequence for the region. Some features of the clay and temper suggested local production rather than trade, which meant whatever tradition had produced this pottery had been making it in the canyon area. But where? When? By whom? The report noted the anomalies, recommended further investigation, and was filed with the appropriate administrative authorities. The recommended further investigation was not conducted, at least not in any way that generated a public record. The anomalous materials from the Nankoweap Delta survey of 1975 entered the institutional literature as a small, unresolved footnote. 40 years later, a different team of researchers, revisiting old survey reports from the canyon, came across the 1975 Nankoweap report. They attempted to locate the original samples for modern analysis using techniques not available in 1975. Some of the samples had been properly archived and were accessible. Some had not been preserved. The pottery sherds, the most analytically interesting material, could not all be located. The research team published a paper noting the anomaly and calling for renewed investigation of the Nankoweap Delta area. The paper was published in a regional archaeology journal with limited circulation. It generated some interest among specialists. It generated no popular attention whatsoever. And that is where that particular thread of the canyon's anomalous history currently sits. A documented, peer-reviewed observation of something unexpected in a known archaeological region of the canyon, with a call for further investigation that has not been answered. Not suppressed, not denied, just unfinished. Just waiting for resources and access and attention that have not yet materialized. This is how the canyon's secrets actually work, not with dramatic revelations and government cover-ups, but with surveys that find anomalies and recommend further study, with further study that does not materialize, with reports that enter institutional archives and are read by a handful of specialists and then quietly sit there, waiting. The Grand Canyon accumulates anomalies the way it accumulates sediment, slowly, persistently, in layers that the unaided eye cannot easily distinguish, but that the trained observer can recognize as carrying information about a past that we have not yet fully reconstructed. Now, let us talk about light. At certain times of day, at certain times of year, the light in the Grand Canyon does something extraordinary. It transforms. The canyon walls, which in the midday sun appear static, almost two-dimensional in their solidity, come alive at dawn and dusk with an interplay of color and shadow that reveals textures and features invisible at other times. Alcoves that are dark holes in the full sun become, in the raking light of early morning or late afternoon, spaces of nuanced depth, their interior features made suddenly visible by the angle of illumination. Archaeological surveyors who work in the canyon have learned to use this light. Features that ground-level surveys in full sun completely miss become visible in aerial photographs taken at the right time of day. Subtle modifications to cliff faces, possible carved features, the outlines of what might be structural remnants, all of these emerge in the raking light in ways that the flat illumination of high sun obliterates. Recent developments in remote sensing technology have made it possible to extend this principle further. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a technology that bounces laser pulses off surfaces and measures the return time to construct precise three-dimensional maps, has transformed archaeology in forested landscapes, like the jungles of Guatemala, where it has revealed the full extent of the Maya civilization in unprecedented detail. LiDAR penetrates tree canopy and maps the ground beneath it, revealing structures and roads and agricultural terraces invisible to aerial photography. The Grand Canyon does not have a tree canopy problem. Its surfaces are generally exposed. But it has an analogous problem, one of scale and shadow, and the sheer complexity of surfaces in a place this vast and this deeply eroded. LiDAR surveys of specific canyon sections have the potential to reveal subtle artificial features in the canyon walls that conventional photography and ground survey miss. Such surveys have been conducted in some portions of the canyon. The results have not been fully published, but researchers who have been involved in the work have indicated that the technology is revealing a level of archaeological complexity in the canyon surfaces that existing surveys have significantly underestimated. More structures than previously documented. More modifications to natural features. More evidence of human activity in locations that were previously thought to be archaeologically empty. This is not a claim that LiDAR is revealing Egyptian temples or lost civilizations. It is a claim that the archaeological footprint of the Grand Canyon's human inhabitants, over the full 12,000 years or more of documented occupation, is larger and more complex than was previously understood. That the canyon supported more people, engaged in more varied activities, over a longer period and in more locations than the conventional accounts have described. This is not a small revision. It is, in its way, a significant upward reassessment of the human history of the place, and it suggests that similar reassessments in other currently under-surveyed portions of the canyon may produce similarly significant results. The canyon is telling us something. The message is being received slowly, incompletely, in the scattered fragments that decades of under-resourced investigation have managed to gather, but it is coming through. And what it is saying, with increasing clarity, is that this is not a simple place. It has never been a simple place. The people who lived here were not simple. Their history is not simple. And the story that the textbooks tell, the story of a handful of known cultures occupying a well-understood landscape in a reasonably well-documented sequence, is a sketch of the first few lines of a document that runs for pages we have not yet learned to read. Let us come back, for a final time, to the question of what is hidden. Hidden is an interesting word when you apply it to the Grand Canyon, because the canyon hides things in multiple senses. It hides them physically, in remote alcoves and deep cave systems, and behind walls of rock that require days of technical effort to approach. It hides them institutionally, in the archives of organizations and the collections of museums and the reports of surveys that never found the resources for follow-through. It hides them culturally, in the oral traditions and sacred knowledge of indigenous communities who have not found reason to share everything they know with the outside world. And it hides them from itself, in the sense that the canyon's own geological complexity makes interpretation of what it contains an ongoing and genuinely difficult scientific challenge. In all of these senses, the canyon is still hiding things, not because anyone particularly wants it to, not because there is a coordinated effort to maintain secrets, but because the task of fully knowing this place is simply larger than any human effort has yet been able to match. The 1909 Arizona Gazette story, whatever its truth value, captured something real about the canyon's character. It captured the sense that this place contains more than it reveals, that its depths, in every sense, have not been plumbed, that the story of what happened here, and who was here, and what they knew and built and left behind, is bigger and stranger and more interesting than any version of it we have managed to tell so far. That sense is not a product of conspiratorial thinking. It is the appropriate response to a place that has been accumulating the evidence of human activity for 12,000 years, in a landscape so vast and so complex that even a century and a half of systematic investigation has barely scratched the surface. The Grand Canyon deserves better. It deserves the full application of every tool that 21st century science can bring to bear on the questions it raises. It deserves the respectful engagement of the indigenous communities, whose knowledge of this place extends further than any outside researchers. It deserves the honest, patient, adequately funded investigation that its scale and significance have never quite received. Until it gets that investigation, the mysteries will remain. They will continue to generate exactly the kind of speculation that the 1909 Gazette story represents, the human imagination reaching for the grandest possible explanation of a place that seems to demand one. And until the full story is known, the canyon will keep its secrets. There is a moment, if you have ever stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon at dusk, when the light begins to leave the sky above and descends into the canyon itself, pooling in the lower gorges and gathering in the shadowed alcoves, and painting the high buttes in shades of red and orange and gold that seem to have nothing to do with the ordinary palette of the physical world. At that moment, the canyon seems to breathe, the shadows move, the distances collapse and expand simultaneously. The geological layers, which in the daylight look simply old, in that light look wise, as though they have been paying attention for a very long time and have opinions they have not yet chosen to share. The canyon is waiting for the right question, for the right expedition, for someone with the resources and the access and the patience to look carefully enough, long enough, deeply enough. The scientists who have devoted their careers to understanding this place understand something that the sensation seekers and the conspiracy theorists and the headline writers have never quite grasped. The truth of the Grand Canyon is not going to arrive in a single dramatic revelation. It is not going to be a newspaper headline. It is not going to be a press conference at the Smithsonian. It is going to come the way it always comes in science, slowly, incrementally, through the patient accumulation of evidence gathered by people who are willing to spend their careers in the uncomfortable, underfunded, often frustrating work of trying to understand a place that is under no obligation to make itself understood. And when it comes, it will be bigger than any of the dramatic theories. It will be more complex, more layered, more genuinely surprising than any single story about Egyptian temples or lost civilizations or government cover-ups could capture. Because the truth of what happened in the Grand Canyon, over 12,000 years or more of human occupation, on a landscape that has been carved and carved and carved again over 2 billion years, is a truth of extraordinary scale and depth. Let us talk about the canyon's river one more time, because the Colorado carries one more secret that deserves telling. When John Wesley Powell floated the river in 1869, he noted in his journals something that later geologists have confirmed and elaborated. The Colorado River, in its passage through the Grand Canyon, is not a simple channel. It is a layered thing. At the surface, the water moves in complex patterns, boiling up from depth, spinning in eddies, gathering and releasing according to the shape of the channel bottom and the features of the canyon walls. But beneath the surface, there are layers. The river's deep water flows differently from its surface water. The sediment it carries is sorted by depth. The temperature varies with depth in ways that reflect the river's history, as it has gathered waters from springs and tributaries across hundreds of miles. In this sense, the river is a metaphor for everything else about the canyon. There are layers. The surface is one thing, the depth is another. And the relationship between the two is complex, constantly shifting, never fully resolved. The ancient inhabitants of the canyon understood this in a practical sense. They read the river the way they read everything else in their environment, as a text that, properly interpreted, revealed the deep patterns underlying the visible surface. They knew when the river was carrying snowmelt from distant mountains. They knew when a tributary was in flood. They knew which sections of the river were passable and which were death traps for anything that entered them. They accumulated this knowledge over generations and encoded it in stories and practices that made them effective inhabitants of one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. We have lost most of that knowledge. The river has been dammed, its flow controlled and regularized by the Glen Canyon Dam upstream, and the natural patterns of sediment flow and seasonal flooding that the ancient inhabitants understood have been fundamentally altered. The river that flows through the canyon today is not the river that shaped the human history of the place. It is a managed version of that river, stripped of the seasonal extremes and the dynamic sediment movement that made it what it was. This loss is not just ecological, it is also archaeological. The sediment that the undammed river deposited and redistributed through the canyon covered and preserved archaeological sites in some places and exposed others according to a complex, natural rhythm. The dammed river disrupts that rhythm. Archaeological sites that were protected by sediment deposition are being eroded by the clearer, faster-moving water released from the dam. Other sites that might have been covered and preserved by natural sedimentation are instead being exposed to erosion before they can be properly documented and studied. The archaeological heritage of the Grand Canyon is, in a very practical sense, being lost. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, as erosion claims riverside sites and as the natural processes that preserved the canyon's human history for 12,000 years. This is an argument not just for better archaeological investigation, but for better stewardship of the canyon's resources in every sense. The mystery of what happened in the Grand Canyon is a mystery that can only be solved if we manage to preserve the evidence long enough to examine it carefully. And the window for doing so, while not closed, is not unlimited. The canyon has been patient. 2 billion years of patience accumulated in stone. But the evidence of the human story that it contains is more fragile than the stone. It is being lost, grain by grain, from riverbanks and eroding cliff faces, and vandalized rock art panels, and looted archaeological sites. Every year that passes without adequate systematic investigation is a year in which some portion of the answer to the question of what really happened here disappears forever. There is urgency here. The canyon is an emergency, not in the sense of immediate catastrophe, but in the sense of a slow-moving loss that will eventually foreclose the possibility of the answers we are still seeking. Some researchers who have spent careers in the canyon understand this urgency in a way that outsiders rarely do. They have watched sites disappear. They have documented the difference between what a site looked like on a first visit and what it looked like 10 years later. The slow erosion, the collapse of walls, the displacement of artifacts by water and wind, and the passage of careless feet. They know what is being lost, and they know what might still be found if the resources and the access and the institutional will ever align to make a comprehensive investigation possible. In the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, where the Vishnu schist rises in dark walls on either side of the Colorado, and the narrow strip of visible sky above seems impossibly remote, there is a quality of silence that is unlike silence anywhere else. The water moves constantly, churning and rushing, but that sound is so consistent and so complete that it becomes a kind of silence itself, a sound that fills every frequency and somehow resolves into the quality of no sound. The walls are close enough that you can almost touch both sides at once. The rock is dark and complex, layered in ways that speak of pressures and temperatures that would be instantly lethal to any organism, pressures and temperatures that existed nearly 2 billion years before the first living cell appeared on Earth. In that place, standing in the deepest accessible part of the deepest canyon on the continent, surrounded by rock that is almost as old as the planet itself, the question of what happened here, what was built here, who passed through here, and what they knew and what they left behind, does not feel like an academic question. It feels like the most important question in the world, because what the canyon is asking, in its ancient and patient way, is the question that underlies all of archaeology, all of history, all of the human impulse to understand the past. It is asking who we are, and where we came from, and what came before us, and what, if anything, we are inheriting from those who walked this landscape before us. The answers are in the stone, They are in the artifacts and the bones and the pictographs and the oral traditions and the survey reports and the archived samples. They are waiting. They will not wait forever. The most recent studies of the Grand Canyon's archaeological heritage, surveys conducted with modern technology and fresh eyes, suggest that the conventional inventory of archaeological sites in the canyon represents perhaps 20 to 30% of what actually exists there. The remaining 70 to 80% has not been systematically documented. It is out there, in the remote side canyons and the high cliff faces and the deep cave systems that require significant effort to reach. It is waiting for investigators who are willing to make that effort, with adequate resources and adequate time and adequate respect for the indigenous communities whose ancestors created much of what is waiting to be found. This is not a small undertaking. It is, frankly, a generational project. The complete archaeological documentation of the Grand Canyon, done properly, with the care and the thoroughness and the engagement with indigenous knowledge that it deserves, would require the sustained commitment of significant resources over decades. It has not had those resources. It may not get them. The funding of archaeological research in America has never matched the scale of what remains to be done, but the possibility exists. The technology exists. The methodology exists. The questions are clear. What is needed is the will to pursue them, and the patience to accept that the answers will come not in dramatic revelations, but in the slow, cumulative progress of careful science. The Grand Canyon is the longest-running unsolved mystery in American history. It has been generating questions since the first human being stood at its rim and looked down and wondered what was at the bottom. Some of those questions have been answered. The geological ones, largely. The broad outlines of the human occupation, partially. The specific content of the most remote and most ancient and most inaccessible corners, not yet. Not yet is different from never, and the canyon has always rewarded those who were willing to wait and to look carefully and to bring to their investigation the same patience that the canyon itself embodies. 12,000 years of human patience, 2 billion years of geological patience. The patience of a place that knows it will outlast every theory that has ever been proposed about it, every investigator who has ever descended into it, every mystery that has ever been attributed to it. There is a story still being told in the layers of the Grand Canyon. We have read perhaps the first few pages. There are chapters we have not reached. There are passages in languages we have not yet learned to read. The scientists who found things in the Grand Canyon that shocked them, who went quiet in the face of what they found, who filed their reports and moved on without making the kind of public noise that would have drawn attention to the magnitude of what they had discovered, those scientists understood something important. The canyon is bigger than any single discovery. It is bigger than any single theory. It is bigger than any single human institution. It is the most ancient, publicly accessible place in North America, and its secrets are not going anywhere. They are patient, the way stone is patient. They are deep, the way time is deep. And they are waiting, with a patience that makes our urgency look very small and very brief, for the moment when we are finally ready to truly understand them. The walls are still there. The layers are still accumulating. The shadows are moving through the gorge right now, as you listen to this, as the Colorado does what it has always done, carrying the weight of half a continent toward the sea in the dark. Somewhere in those walls, something is waiting to be found. The canyon is not finished with its secrets. And the story of what scientists found at the Grand Canyon, the real story, the full story, the story that takes in everything from the 1,909 newspaper account to the most recent LiDAR surveys, from the Stanton's cave megafauna bones to the Hopi traditions of emergence, from the unusual kivas to the hydraulic engineering that no known culture fully accounts for, that story has not yet been fully told. It may not be told in any of our lifetimes, but it is there, in the stone, in the silence, in the 2 billion years of patience that the canyon wears in its walls like a garment made of time itself. And we are still, all of us, in the very early stages of learning to read it. The Grand Canyon does not yield its secrets easily. It never has. But for those willing to go deep enough, to look carefully enough, to ask the right questions with the right humility and the right patience, it has always had something extraordinary to offer. A glimpse into time so deep that ordinary human categories of history and civilization and discovery simply dissolve. A recognition that the story of people on this continent is far older, far more complex, and far more surprising than any version of it we have managed to tell so far. That is what the scientists found at the Grand Canyon. Not a single dramatic discovery that changes everything in an afternoon. Something more profound than that. An ongoing encounter with a mystery that refuses to be exhausted. A place that keeps revealing new layers of its complexity to every generation that approaches it, with genuine curiosity and genuine respect for what it has taken 2 billion years to build. The canyon is still there. The questions are still there. The answers are somewhere in those walls, layered into the rock with the same patience and the same permanence that the rock itself embodies. We are still looking. We are still listening. And the canyon, in its ancient and unhurried way, is still speaking. There is a detail in the geological record of the Grand Canyon that very few people outside of specialist circles have ever had occasion to consider, and it is a detail that matters enormously to the question of what the canyon is and what it might contain. The detail involves something called the Great Unconformity. An unconformity in geology is a gap in the rock record, a place where layers that should be present are absent, where time has been erased from the stone sequence. Unconformities can happen for many reasons. Erosion can carry away layers that were once present, or a period of no deposition can leave a gap between the layers above and below, or tectonic forces can tilt and disturb the record. The point is that unconformities represent missing time, chapters torn from the geological book. The Grand Canyon contains one of the most dramatic unconformities in the world. It is called the Great Unconformity, and it represents a gap in the rock record of approximately 1 billion years, 1,000 million years, gone, erased, removed. What was there was stripped away, and then the layers above it were deposited on top of the stripped surface, as though a billion years of history had simply never happened. The Great Unconformity is visible in the canyon walls in a very dramatic way. You can see, with your own eyes, the place where one rock layer meets another across a gap of a billion years. Below the line, rocks of one type and age. Above it, rocks of an entirely different type and age. The boundary between them is remarkably clean, sharp, almost unnervingly precise for something that happened nearly 500 million years ago. Geologists have known about the Great Unconformity for over a century. They have generally attributed it to a major episode of erosion associated with an ancient mountain-building event, followed by a long period of continental flat terrain, during which rivers stripped away everything that had previously been deposited. It is a reasonable explanation. It accounts for the basic facts. But in recent years, a competing hypothesis has emerged. Some geologists have proposed that the Great Unconformity was not the product of gradual erosion over hundreds of millions of years, but was instead created in a relatively short time by a catastrophic event, specifically by the freezing and melting of a global glaciation event known as Snowball Earth, a period roughly 600 million to 700 million years ago, when the entire surface of the planet may have been covered in ice, from pole to equator. The Snowball Earth hypothesis is itself controversial. The evidence for it is real but incomplete. What the evidence clearly shows is that there were at least 2 major global glaciation events in the period immediately preceding the Cambrian explosion, the remarkable period when complex multicellular life suddenly appeared in the fossil record after billions of years of microbial life. The relationship between these glaciation events, the Great Unconformity, and the Cambrian explosion is a subject of active and genuinely important scientific research. For our purposes, what matters is this. The Grand Canyon's geological record contains, right there in the canyon walls, one of the most vivid and accessible illustrations of the incompleteness of what we know about the deep history of this planet. A billion years of rock, gone. An explanation for its disappearance that is still being actively debated. And directly above the point of that disappearance, the explosion of complex life that eventually led to everything, to plants and animals and fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals, and eventually to the human beings who stand at the canyon rim and stare into it. All of that history is visible in those walls. All of those questions are encoded in the layers. This is not a mystery in the sense of something being hidden. the Great Unconformity has been known and studied since the 19th century. But it is a reminder that the Grand Canyon's significance is not limited to its human history. It is a place where the deep history of the entire planet is made visible, and where the questions it raises extend far beyond archaeology into the most fundamental questions about how this planet came to be what it is, and how life on it came to be what it is. The human story we have been exploring, the story of the people who lived here and what they found and built and left behind, unfolds in the uppermost few layers of a geological library that goes down 2 billion years. The entire span of human existence, even in the broadest possible sense, occupies the thinnest imaginable sliver at the very top of that library. Everything below it is pre-human, pre-animal, pre-complex life. This perspective does not diminish the human story. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that we are reading the very last pages of a very long book, and that even those pages are only partially legible. Let us return, once more, to the question of what was found. Because there is a category of discovery in the Grand Canyon that has received almost no public attention despite being, in its own way, as remarkable as anything reported in the 1909 newspaper story. And that category involves the canyon's biological secrets. The Grand Canyon is one of the most biologically diverse places in North America. Its 1,000-foot elevation change from rim to river bottom encompasses 5 distinct climate zones, from the cold boreal forest of the North Rim to the desert scrubland of the Inner Gorge, a range comparable to the ecological diversity you would encounter driving from Canada to Mexico. This extraordinary environmental diversity has made the canyon a refuge for species that have survived here while disappearing from surrounding areas, and a laboratory for evolution, with populations of the same species isolated on different sides of the canyon by the unbridgeable barrier of the river. The canyon is home to several species found nowhere else on Earth. The kaibab squirrel, living on the North Rim, has been separated from its closest relative, the abert squirrel of the South Rim, for an estimated 12,000 years, exactly the period of significant human occupation, and has diverged enough in that time to be classified as a distinct species. There are fish in the Colorado River that evolved in the canyon's unique aquatic environment and exist nowhere else. There are plants found on specific canyon ledges at specific elevations that are not known from any other location. And in the canyon's remote cave systems, which provide stable temperature and humidity conditions very different from the desert environment outside, there is a biological world that has been almost entirely uninvestigated. Cave biology in the American Southwest is a young field. The systematic inventory of cave-dwelling organisms, the bacteria, fungi, invertebrates, and other life forms that inhabit the dark, stable environments deep inside karst formations, has barely begun. What has been found in the few caves that have been investigated is remarkable. New species, new genera, organisms that have been evolving in isolation in these cave environments for so long that they bear only distant resemblance to any of their surface-dwelling relatives. These biological discoveries are not archaeological mysteries, but they are mysteries in a deeper sense. They are evidence that even in the 21st century, on a continent that has been densely populated for centuries and intensively studied for 150 years, there are still places where the inventory of what exists is genuinely incomplete, where the question of what lives here, let alone what happened here, remains genuinely open. The cave systems of the Grand Canyon are the most dramatic example of this. The caves we know about, the ones that have been investigated to any degree, represent a fraction of what almost certainly exists in the canyon's limestone formations. The full extent of the canyon's cave systems is unknown. The biology of those systems is almost entirely unexplored. The archaeology of them, what human presence, if any, exists in their deeper reaches, is effectively zero. Zero is not a measurement. Zero is an absence of measurement. And in the Grand Canyon, the absence of measurement does not mean the absence of things worth measuring. It means we have not looked. Let us consider the question of pre-Columbian long-distance trade, because it is relevant to understanding what kind of civilization the Grand Canyon region might have supported. Pre-Columbian North America was not a collection of isolated, self-sufficient communities. It was a network. a complex, continent-spanning network of trade relationships that moved materials, ideas, and cultural practices over distances of thousands of miles. The evidence for this network is extensive and well documented. Copper from the Great Lakes appears in burial mounds in the Mississippi Valley. Obsidian from volcanic sources in Idaho appears at archaeological sites throughout the Southwest. Turquoise from mines in New Mexico appears in sites in Mexico and California. Shell from the Pacific coast appears at sites on the Atlantic coast. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico appear at sites in Wisconsin and Michigan. The scale and sophistication of this network is genuinely impressive. And the Grand Canyon sat at a crossroads of it. The Colorado River corridor was a major route of movement and exchange. The canyon's turquoise deposits, its copper, its minerals, its botanical resources, all of these made it a significant node in the broader trade network of pre-Columbian North America. This has an important implication for the question of what was found in the canyon. If the canyon was a significant node in a continent-spanning trade network, then materials found there, and cultural influences reflected in what was built there, could potentially have come from almost anywhere in North America. The unusual kivas, the anomalous pottery styles, the atypical architectural techniques, all of these could reflect the influence of long-distance trade contacts, bringing ideas and practices from distant parts of the continent. This does not explain the more extreme claims, the Egyptian connection, the copper weapons and hieroglyphs account of 1909, but it does suggest that the cultural complexity of the Grand Canyon region, the mixing of influences and traditions that shows up in the archaeological record, has a straightforward explanation that does not require appeal to transoceanic contact or suppressed civilizations. It reflects the participation of the canyon's inhabitants in the broad, complex, continent-spanning world of pre-Columbian North America. That world has been systematically underestimated by Euro-American scholarship. The old narrative of isolated, primitive peoples has been replaced, slowly and incompletely, by a more accurate picture of sophisticated, interconnected societies engaged in trade, diplomacy, religious exchange, and cultural borrowing across vast distances. The Grand Canyon fits into this picture. Its anomalies are the anomalies of a crossroads culture, a place where things from many different traditions came together and interacted in ways that left distinctive traces in the archaeological record. This is a more mundane explanation than the ones that get attention, but it is also, in its own way, more interesting, because it tells us something real about the sophistication and the reach of the cultures that lived here, about the world they were part of and the networks they participated in. It tells us that the ancient inhabitants of the Grand Canyon were not isolated primitives, but members of a complex, continental civilization that we are only beginning to understand. Now let us talk about what archaeology can tell us about the daily life of the people who actually lived in the canyon, because in the focus on mysteries and anomalies, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that real people lived here, raised children here, grew food here, made art here, conducted ceremonies here, buried their dead here, and generally got on with the business of being human in one of the most extraordinary environments on Earth. The daily life of the ancestral Puebloans in the Grand Canyon can be reconstructed in considerable detail from the archaeological evidence they left behind. They were farmers who grew maize, beans, and squash on terraced ledges, watered by systems of check dams and irrigation channels that captured seasonal runoff. The farming was difficult. The growing season was short and unpredictable. The soil was thin and rocky, but these people had generations of accumulated knowledge about how to coax productivity from this challenging landscape, and they did it successfully for centuries. They supplemented their agricultural diet with hunting and gathering. The canyon is rich in game. Deer and bighorn sheep were the primary large game animals, and their bones are found in abundance at ancestral Puebloan sites throughout the canyon. Rabbits, which could be caught in large numbers by communal drives using long nets of woven fibers, provided another significant protein source. The river itself provided fish, though fish bones are less common in archaeological deposits than mammal bones, possibly because smaller fish bones are less well preserved, or because fishing was less central to the diet than hunting. They made pottery of considerable sophistication. The ceramic traditions of the ancestral Puebloans represent one of the highest achievements of pre-Columbian North American art. Their black-on-white pottery, decorated with geometric patterns of extraordinary complexity and precision, was made without a potter's wheel, built up by hand, using the coil and scrape technique, fired in open kilns, and finished to a quality that has never been surpassed in the Southwest. The patterns on these vessels are not random decoration. They encode information, astronomical patterns, ceremonial symbols, clan identifications, stories told in visual language for people who read that language as easily as we read words. They built in stone, with a skill that continues to impress engineers and architects who study their constructions. The dry stone masonry of their cliff dwellings, mortared with mud and shaped into walls of remarkable precision and stability, has survived for 1,000 years in the canyon environment without significant deterioration. The largest of their canyon buildings were multi-story structures with dozens of rooms, housing extended family groups in a complex of interconnected spaces organized around central plazas and ceremonial kivas. The layout of these buildings was not random. It followed specific spatial and social logics that reflected the organization of the community and the requirements of ceremonial practice. They were accomplished weavers. Cotton cloth, made from cotton grown in the lower, warmer sections of the canyon, was produced in a wide range of types and patterns, from simple utilitarian fabrics to elaborate ceremonial garments decorated with complex geometric patterns. The cotton came from trade as well as local production, since the growing conditions in the Upper Canyon are not well suited to cotton agriculture. Fiber from wild plants, particularly yucca and other agave family plants, was used for baskets and sandals and cordage. The craftsmanship of these items was high, with sandal patterns that varied by region and social group and that served in part as identity markers. Their astronomical knowledge was impressive. The orientation of major buildings at their most significant sites shows systematic alignment with the cardinal directions and with specific astronomical events, the solstices, the equinoxes, the rising and setting of particular stars. Spiral petroglyphs in certain canyon locations mark specific solar events with shadow and light effects that are accurate to within minutes over centuries. This knowledge was not the product of casual observation. It required systematic record-keeping and the transmission of detailed technical knowledge across generations. It implies a social organization that valued and preserved intellectual traditions, a society with something that functions like specialized knowledge keepers. Their ceremonial life was rich and complex. The kiva, the underground ceremonial chamber, was the center of community ritual life. Ceremonies marked the agricultural cycle, the astronomical cycle, the social transitions of birth and death and initiation. The Kachina religion, which is well documented in later Pueblo cultures and appears to have roots in the ancestral Puebloan tradition, involved complex costumed performances representing spirit beings who served as intermediaries between the human world and the spiritual world. The masks, costumes, and ritual objects associated with these ceremonies were made with considerable artistic skill and were objects of great power and significance. This was not a simple society. It was not a primitive society. It was a complex, sophisticated, richly cultured community of people who had developed, over centuries of practice, a profound and detailed understanding of their environment and a rich intellectual and spiritual tradition for interpreting and responding to it. And somewhere in the course of that complex social history, something happened that left anomalies in the archaeological record. Something that the conventional story of ancestral Puebloan culture does not fully account for. The unusual kivas, the hydraulic engineering, the anomalous pottery, the evidence of occupation in locations and at periods not predicted by the standard sequence. What was it? We do not know. But we can say with confidence that whatever it was, it happened to real people, living real lives, in a real and specific place, not to abstractions, not to the nameless ancestors of legend, to people who grew maize and built in stone and wove cotton cloth and watched the stars from carefully aligned observation points cut into the canyon's walls. Their descendants are still here. They live on the mesas and in the valleys around the canyon. They maintain traditions that stretch back to the people who built in the canyon, that encode in ceremonial form knowledge about this landscape and its history that has been transmitted across hundreds of generations. Whatever was found in the Grand Canyon, whatever secrets it contains, it belongs to them more than to anyone else. Their ancestors put it there. Their traditions carry its echo. Their ceremonial knowledge is its living continuation. The scientific investigation of the canyon's mysteries is valuable and important, but it will not be complete without the willing participation of the indigenous communities whose heritage is at stake. And that participation cannot be obtained by simply showing up with LiDAR equipment and a research permit. It requires relationship, respect, patience, and a genuine commitment to the principle that the knowledge held in living indigenous traditions is as valuable as the knowledge produced by scientific investigation. Some researchers have understood this and have worked accordingly. The best archaeological work in the Grand Canyon region has been collaborative, involving tribal monitors, tribal historians, and tribal knowledge keepers as full partners in the research enterprise. This approach takes longer. It is more complicated. It requires continuous negotiation and relationship maintenance. But it produces better results because the indigenous partners bring knowledge and perspectives that the outside researcher does not have, knowledge of where to look and what to look for and what significance to attach to what is found. This is how the mysteries of the Grand Canyon will ultimately be resolved, not by dramatic solo expeditions or sensational newspaper stories or institutional cover-ups, but by patient, collaborative, adequately resourced investigation conducted with the full engagement of the communities whose heritage is at stake. We are not there yet, but the possibility exists. Consider for a moment the sheer weight of what we are dealing with when we try to understand the Grand Canyon's human history. 12,000 years. That is roughly 600 human generations. If you imagine each generation as a single link in a chain, the chain connecting the first people who stood at the rim of the canyon and looked down into it with the people standing there today is 600 links long. That is a long chain, and at each link, things happened. People were born and lived and died. They learned things and forgot things. They built and abandoned. They moved and settled. They traded and fought and worshipped and wondered. Most of what happened at most of those links is gone. Not suppressed, not hidden, just gone. The way most of what happens in any human life is gone. The details, the texture, the specificity of daily experience, all of it dissolving into the past, leaving behind only the most durable traces, the stone walls and the ceramic sherds and the charcoal from fires, and the occasional preserved organic material that happens to find itself in conditions that allow its survival. From those traces, archaeologists attempt to reconstruct not just what happened, but what it meant. Not just where the walls were, but who built them, and why, and how they lived within them. Not just what the pottery looked like, but what it was for, and who made it, and what the patterns on it signified. This is a difficult task. It is a task that requires imagination, as well as evidence. The disciplined imagination of someone who knows the evidence well enough to know what it will and will not support, who can see what the traces imply without seeing what they do not. The Grand Canyon's archaeological record is rich enough to support this kind of disciplined imagination. It is not so complete that all the important questions are already answered. There is room, in what we know and do not know, for a genuinely surprising picture to emerge from more thorough investigation. A picture that would not necessarily involve Egyptian temples or lost civilizations, but that might well involve a level of social complexity, a reach of cultural connection, a sophistication of environmental knowledge and management that would substantially revise the conventional understanding of what pre-Columbian North America was. That revision is already underway. It has been underway for decades, driven by accumulating evidence from sites across the continent that keeps pushing the picture of pre-Columbian civilization towards something larger and more complex than the old narratives allowed. The Grand Canyon has contributed to this revision and will contribute more as its archaeological record is more completely documented. The canyon is not separate from the story of pre-Columbian America. It is a central chapter of it. The Colorado River Corridor was one of the main arteries of movement and exchange across the western part of the continent. The canyon's resources were embedded in trade networks that reached from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Great Basin to the Rio Grande Valley. The people who lived here were not isolated. They were connected, in complex and dynamic ways to a broader world of exchange and interaction that we are still working to fully map. Let us talk about one more thread before we bring this to its close. There is a phenomenon in the Grand Canyon that has been observed and documented and discussed in a relatively small number of specialist publications, and that represents perhaps the most intriguing of all the canyon's documented anomalies. It has to do with sound. The Grand Canyon is, in certain conditions, a remarkable acoustic environment. The shape of the canyon, the hardness and reflectivity of its walls, the way the wind moves through it in predictable patterns driven by the daily heating and cooling of the rock, all of these create conditions in which sound behaves in unexpected ways. Sounds made at one point in the canyon can be heard clearly at distant points that are not in direct line of sight. Whispers can carry over remarkable distances. Sounds produced at the canyon floor can be heard at the rim, and sounds from the rim can reach locations in the inner gorge. The ancient inhabitants of the canyon were aware of this. The positioning of certain rock art panels, certain ceremonial features, certain habitation sites shows a pattern that researchers studying canyon acoustics have identified as consistent with a deliberate exploitation of the canyon's sonic properties. Sites were chosen not just for their defensive advantages or their proximity to water or their agricultural potential, but for their acoustic qualities, for what could be heard from them and what could be heard at them. This is not a minor detail. It suggests that the people who lived in the canyon had a sophisticated enough understanding of their acoustic environment to factor it into their decisions about where to build and how to conduct certain activities. Ceremonies that exploited the canyon's natural amplification and echo effects. Communication systems that used the canyon's acoustic properties to carry sound over distances that would otherwise require physical messengers. A relationship to the sonic landscape of the canyon that was as developed and as informed as their relationship to the visual landscape. Some researchers studying the acoustics of ancient spaces have proposed that the extraordinary sonic properties of certain archaeological sites, prehistoric caves in France with their dramatic natural reverb, the great stone circles of Britain with their complex patterns of resonance and reflection, the underground kivas of the southwest with their unique auditory qualities, were not incidental features but were deliberately exploited, possibly central to the ceremonial and communicative functions of these spaces. The canyon, on this view, was not just a physical landscape, but an acoustic one, a complex sonic environment that the people who lived here understood and used and incorporated into their ceremonies and their daily life. Whether this is true in the specific ways that the acoustic researchers propose is open to debate, but the underlying principle, that the ancient inhabitants of the Grand Canyon were sophisticated enough to notice and exploit the non-obvious properties of their environment, including its acoustic properties, is consistent with everything else we know about them. These were not primitive people stumbling blindly through an environment they did not understand. They were expert inhabitants of one of the most complex and demanding landscapes on Earth, people who had accumulated over generations a detailed, practical, multi-sensory knowledge of the place they called home. And that knowledge, in all its dimensions, is part of what was lost when these cultures were disrupted and eventually displaced by European expansion. Not in the dramatic, sudden way of a single catastrophe, but slowly, over generations, as communities were relocated and traditional territories were no longer accessible, and the specific local knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries became irrelevant in the new conditions created by the colonial transformation of North America. What we are trying to recover, through archaeology and ethnography, and the patient collaboration with indigenous communities that represents the best of current practice in this field, is a fragment of that lost knowledge. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to give us a more accurate picture of what was here and who was here, and how sophisticated and complex the human history of this place actually was. That is the project. That is what the scientists who found things at the Grand Canyon that shocked them were contributing to, in their own way, whether their findings were dramatic or mundane. Every piece of evidence that pushes the picture toward greater complexity, toward a more sophisticated understanding of who the pre-Columbian inhabitants of this region were and what they accomplished, is a piece of the recovery of something that was lost and that is worth finding again. Not just for the sake of historical accuracy, though that matters, but for a deeper reason, for For the same reason that the Hopi maintain their traditions, and the Havasupai tell their stories, and the elders of many tribes speak carefully about the things that are too important to be spoken carelessly. Because the knowledge of how to live well in a specific place, accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation and adjustment, is not just historical curiosity, it is practical wisdom. It is the kind of knowledge that a civilization facing the ecological challenges of the 21st century might find useful if it were wise enough to take it seriously. The people who lived in the Grand Canyon for 12,000 years understood their environment in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate. They managed resources sustainably in a landscape that modern management has not always treated well. They built and farmed and hunted in ways that left the canyon more or less intact for their descendants, generation after generation, in conditions that would challenge any modern agricultural system. There is something to be learned from that. There is knowledge encoded in the ways they built and farmed and organized their communities that could inform our own relationship with this extraordinary place and with the broader ecological systems it is part of. The Grand Canyon's mysteries are not just puzzles for archaeologists to solve. They are challenges to our understanding of who we are and where we come from, and what kind of knowledge we have lost, and what might be recovered if we were willing to look in the right places with the right humility. The walls are still there. The layers are still accumulating. The questions are still waiting for answers. And somewhere in the depths of the most ancient accessible place in North America, in the dark and the silence and the 2 billion-year patience of the stone, the next discovery is waiting. It always has been. It always will be. The Grand Canyon is not finished with its secrets. And we are not finished with the Grand Canyon. The river runs on, carrying its burden of dissolved stone toward the sea, carving new layers of the story with every passing year, every passing century, every passing millennium. The canyon grows infinitesimally deeper with each passing season. The walls reveal new faces as erosion proceeds. New alcoves open, new passages become accessible. New things emerge from the stone, and at the rim, and in the depths, and in the remote side canyons, and the high cliff alcoves, and the unexplored cave systems, the evidence of what happened here, of who was here, and what they knew, and what they left behind, waits with the patience of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has learned not to be in a hurry. The canyon was here before us, it will be here after us. The secrets it contains have survived ice ages and continental drift and the extinction of entire faunas. They will survive our neglect, they will survive our theories, they will survive whatever we choose to believe about them. But they will yield, eventually, to patient investigation conducted with adequate resources and genuine respect for the extraordinary complexity of what is there. That is the promise of this place. That is why, more than a century after a newspaper reported the impossible discovery of an underground city in its walls, the Grand Canyon continues to generate wonder and speculation, and the very human desire to understand something that resists simple understanding. It is the oldest library in North America. Most of its books are still sealed. The reading is slow, the answers are deep, but this library is open, and the most important chapters are still waiting to be found. Let us take a very long and careful walk through what we actually know about the ancestral Puebloan departure from the canyon, because that departure, which happened around the year 1300 AD, is one of the great unresolved mysteries of North American prehistory. And understanding it is essential to understanding what the canyon was and what it might still contain. The abandonment of the Colorado Plateau by the ancestral Puebloans was not a small or local event. It was a demographic upheaval of extraordinary scale. Over the course of roughly a century, from approximately 1250 to 1350 AD, the people who had been living on the Colorado Plateau in dense, sophisticated communities for centuries simply left. They packed up. They migrated. The great houses at Chaco Canyon, some of the largest pre-Columbian buildings in North America, were abandoned. The cliff palaces at Mesa Verde were abandoned. The canyon villages were abandoned. The terraced agricultural systems, the road networks, the elaborate water management infrastructure, all of it, abandoned, left behind, walked away from. Where did they go? The conventional answer is that they moved south and east, dispersing into smaller communities in what is now New Mexico and Arizona, eventually becoming the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples. This is supported by language, by genetic evidence, by cultural continuities in pottery styles and ceremonial traditions. The modern Pueblo peoples do descend from the ancestral Puebloans. That connection is real and well documented, but the abandonment itself remains poorly understood. Why did they leave? The explanations that have been proposed range from the obvious to the speculative. Climate change is the leading candidate. The late 13th century was a period of significant drought across the entire Colorado Plateau. Tree ring records, which are one of the best proxies for ancient climate in the arid West, show a prolonged drought beginning around 1276 and continuing through 1299, a period known to researchers as the Great Drought. This drought would have made the already marginal agricultural conditions on the plateau genuinely impossible, turning formerly productive fields into dust and turning formerly reliable springs into trickles. Social conflict is another major candidate. By the late 13th century, there is archaeological evidence of increased violence in ancestral Puebloan communities. Burned villages, skeletal remains showing evidence of violent death, evidence of migration from more exposed locations to more defensible positions. The society that had been organized around the great ceremonial centers of Chaco Canyon may have been fracturing under the pressures of drought and resource competition, with communities turning against each other rather than cooperating. Disease is a third candidate. The sudden appearance and spread of crowd diseases in populations with no prior exposure can cause population collapses of extraordinary speed and completeness. The ancestral Puebloans lived in dense settlements with close contact between individuals, ideal conditions for the rapid spread of infectious disease. A single introduced pathogen, whether from trade contact with Mesoamerica or from some other source, could have devastated the population in ways that made the existing settlement pattern impossible to maintain. And then there are the more exotic explanations. Some researchers have proposed that the abandonment was connected to the appearance in the southwest of incoming populations from other regions, perhaps ancestors of the Athapascan-speaking peoples, who would eventually become the Navajo and Apache, who may have been raiding ancestral Puebloan settlements and making their continued occupation of exposed plateau sites untenable. Others have proposed a religious dimension to the abandonment, suggesting that the departure from the plateau was not a flight from impossible conditions, but a deliberate religious migration, a response to prophetic traditions or ceremonial requirements that called for a movement to new lands and new relationships with the landscape. The truth is probably some combination of all of these different factors operating in different proportions in different places and at different times, all contributing to a demographic shift of continental significance that reorganized the human geography of the American Southwest in ways that are still visible in the pattern of modern Pueblo communities. But here is what matters for our exploration of the Grand Canyon's mysteries. The abandonment was not complete. Not everyone left. Or more precisely, the archaeological record of the canyon's interior after 1300 AD is not a record of total absence. There are signs of continued, if reduced, occupation. Small sites, isolated features, the traces of people who may have remained in the canyon or who returned to it intermittently for specific purposes after the main population movement had passed. These post-abandonment presences are some of the most interesting and least studied aspects of the canyon's archaeological record. Who stayed? Who came back? What were they doing? What do their traces tell us about the transition between the world of the ancestral Puebloans and the world of the historic era tribes who eventually came to inhabit the canyon region? These questions are not being actively pursued. They are not the questions that attract funding or generate publications in high-profile journals. They are the questions that lie in the spaces between the well-documented chapters of the official story, in the margins and the footnotes, and the sites that are marked on survey maps as low priority for further investigation. Somewhere in those spaces, the connections are waiting to be made. The connections between the people who built the canyon's great settlements and the people who inhabit the canyon today. The connections between the ancestral Puebloan tradition and the specific features of the canyon's archaeological record that do not fit neatly into that tradition. The connections between the documented history and the oral traditions that continue to encode knowledge about this landscape in living cultural forms. Let us think for a moment about the canyon's water, in a different sense from the one we have explored earlier. Water in a desert landscape is not just a resource, it is a relationship. The people who lived in the canyon did not just use water. They had a relationship with water, a set of practices and beliefs and ceremonies that encoded their understanding of where water came from, what it meant, how it behaved, and what was owed to it in return for its cooperation. The Hopi rain ceremonies, among the most elaborate ceremonial systems in North American indigenous religion, are the continuation of traditions that go back to the ancestral Puebloan period and beyond. They represent a sophisticated theological response to the central problem of life in the desert, the unpredictability and scarcity of water, and they incorporate detailed ecological knowledge about the conditions that favor or inhibit rainfall in the specific geography of the Colorado Plateau. Some elements of these ceremonies have been studied by ethnobotanists and ecologists who have found, embedded in the ritual requirements and the symbolic language, accurate observations about the relationships between plant communities and water availability, about the effects of land management practices on local hydrology, about the connections between distant meteorological events and local rainfall patterns. These are not magical beliefs. They are empirical observations encoded in a ceremonial form that ensured their transmission across generations. The same kind of ecological knowledge encoding is found in the oral traditions of the Havasupai, the Navajo, the Zuni, the various Pueblo peoples whose communities surround the Grand Canyon. Their traditions are not just religious stories. They are repositories of accumulated environmental knowledge, observations about the canyon's ecology and geology and hydrology that have been tested over centuries and found reliable. When these traditions speak about specific features of the canyon, specific caves, specific water sources, specific locations with specific properties, they are often speaking from a foundation of real, tested observation. And when they speak about things that were present in the canyon in the past, things that are no longer present or no longer accessible, they may be encoding information about actual historical events, actual changes in the landscape, actual human activities that have left no trace in the archaeological record, but that lived on in the cultural memory of the communities who witnessed them. This is speculative. There is no way to verify, from the outside, how much of any specific oral tradition encodes accurate historical information versus how much reflects the elaboration and transformation that all oral traditions undergo over time. But the general principle that indigenous oral traditions can and sometimes do encode accurate historical information over very long time periods is well established. There are documented cases of oral traditions that have accurately described events that occurred thousands of years ago, geological events like volcanic eruptions and sea level changes and earthquake-induced landscape transformations, events that occurred long before the invention of writing. The Grand Canyon oral traditions speak about the canyon's past with a specificity and a detail that, if even partially accurate, would tell us important things about events in the canyon that the written and archaeological record does not currently document. Not necessarily about Egyptian temples, but about population movements, about environmental changes, about social transformations, about the sequence of events that produced the canyon's current human landscape. We are not collecting those traditions with anywhere near the care and urgency the situation warrants. The elders who hold the deepest knowledge are not getting younger. The transmission of detailed traditional knowledge is not guaranteed in communities that are under multiple pressures from the broader American society. The window for collecting and documenting this knowledge in a way that preserves its detail and its context is not unlimited. This is another kind of urgency that the canyon generates. Not just the urgency of physical sites being eroded and artifacts being degraded, but the urgency of living knowledge being lost. The accumulated wisdom of dozens of generations of careful observers being allowed to dissolve as its carriers age and pass on without adequate opportunities for transmission. The response to this urgency is not just archaeological investigation, it is cultural investment in the communities that hold the knowledge, in the educational and ceremonial systems through which that knowledge is transmitted, in the conditions that make it possible for young people in those communities to be interested in learning what their elders know rather than what the broader American culture offers as an alternative. This is a complicated conversation that goes far beyond the scope of our exploration of the canyon's mysteries. But it is a necessary part of that conversation, because the canyon's mysteries cannot be fully resolved without the knowledge that lives in the communities whose ancestors created the evidence we are trying to interpret. Let us step back from the specific and talk about something more general, something that applies not just to the Grand Canyon, but to the entire project of understanding the human past. Every archaeological site is a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The pieces that survive into the present are an infinitesimally small fraction of everything that once existed. A random sample, in a sense, though not truly random, because different materials survive at different rates, and different conditions of burial and preservation produce wildly different survival probabilities for different kinds of evidence. Organic materials like wood and textiles and bone survive only in specific conditions, in very dry environments, in very cold environments, in waterlogged anaerobic conditions. Stone and fired ceramic survive much better but still suffer damage from physical and chemical processes over time. The patterns created by human activity, the residues of fires, the stains of organic decay, the modifications to soil chemistry, are perhaps the most durable record, but also the most difficult to interpret without the physical objects that created them. What this means in practice is that the picture we can reconstruct from the archaeological record is always partial, always biased towards certain kinds of evidence and certain kinds of activities, always missing the most perishable and often the most socially significant elements of the culture being studied. We know a lot about what people made and what they ate and how they built. We know much less about what they thought and what they believed and how they organized their social lives and what they felt about their world. The Grand Canyon's archaeological record is subject to all these limitations and then some. The canyon's extreme environment, oscillating between baking summer heat and harsh winter cold, with seasonal flash floods that can deposit and remove meters of sediment in a single storm event, is not favorable to the survival of organic materials, except in certain protected cave environments. The accessible sites are not a representative sample of all sites. They are a sample biased toward the cave environments and the protected alcoves where preservation is good, missing the open-air sites where less has survived. This means that the picture we have of the canyon's human history is a picture of the most fortunate survivors, the sites and materials that happen to be in the right conditions to make it through to the present. The less fortunate, the sites and materials that were in the wrong places at the wrong times, are gone, and we have no way of knowing what they contained. This is the fundamental epistemological condition of archaeology. It works with survivors, and the survivors are not a random sample of what once existed. They are a skewed sample, a sample filtered by millions of years of physical and chemical processes, a sample from which we must somehow reconstruct the whole. The Grand Canyon, with its combination of excellent preservation conditions in its caves and abysmal survival conditions on its open surfaces, makes this problem particularly acute. The cave material is rich and well preserved. The surface material has been heavily degraded. The result is a record that overrepresents activities that took place in caves and underrepresents activities that took place in the open, which is to say, most of the activities of daily life. If you were building a picture of modern American culture based solely on what would survive for 1,000 years in cave environments, you would get a very distorted picture. You would know a lot about camping, about seeking shelter, about the objects people bring with them into wilderness environments. You would know almost nothing about cities, about agriculture, about industry, about the full complexity of modern life. The canyon's archaeological record has something of this quality. It tells us a great deal about certain kinds of activities and almost nothing about others. This is not an argument for despair. Imperfect evidence is still evidence. Partial pictures still capture something real. And the ongoing development of new analytical techniques, new approaches to extracting information from the traces that do survive, is continuously expanding what we can learn from the record we have. Stable isotope analysis of human bone can tell us about the diet and the geographic origins of ancient individuals, DNA analysis of ancient remains can reveal patterns of migration and population interaction that no material culture study could detect. Geochemical analysis of pottery can identify the clay sources used in its manufacture, tracing trade networks across the landscape. Phytolith analysis of soil samples can identify the plant communities that once existed at a site. Pollen analysis can reconstruct past vegetation and climate. Micromorphology, the microscopic analysis of sediment composition, can identify the sequence of deposits in a site with extraordinary precision. All of these techniques are being applied to Grand Canyon sites. All of them are producing new information, and all of them are confirming, in different ways, the same general picture that the old-fashioned stratigraphic excavation already suggested, that the human history of the Grand Canyon is more complex, more layered, more ancient, and more surprising than the textbooks have described. The revolution in our understanding of the pre-Columbian Americas that has been underway for decades is not finished. It is still gaining momentum. The accumulation of new evidence and new analytical capability is continuously pushing the picture towards something larger and more sophisticated. And the Grand Canyon, as one of the central sites of that pre-Columbian world, is central to that revolution. Now let us consider the canyon from the perspective of a specific kind of observer who has not yet figured in our exploration, the river runner. The Colorado River through the Grand Canyon is one of the great whitewater river trips on Earth. Tens of thousands of people run it every year, in commercial rafts operated by professional guide services and in private expeditions planned years in advance of the permit lottery that controls access. They spend anywhere from a week to 3 weeks on the river, camping on sandy beaches at the water's edge, hiking the side canyons, swimming in clear tributary streams, lying under a sky so dark that the Milky Way is not just visible but dramatic, a river of light across the canyon walls. These river runners see the Grand Canyon in a way that no other category of visitor does. They see it from the bottom, from the river itself, looking up at walls that rise a mile above them. They access tributary canyons that are reachable only from the river. They camp in locations that are inaccessible by any other route. They spend enough time in the canyon to begin to see past the obvious and to notice things that the quick tourist visit at the rim cannot reveal. And river runners, over the decades, have been among the most consistent reporters of anomalous features in the canyon's more remote sections, not Egyptian temples, but caves at unexpected heights on canyon walls, modifications to natural features that look deliberate, concentrations of what might be pottery sherds in locations that should not have been accessible to prehistoric inhabitants. The kinds of observations that, when reported to professional archaeologists, are sometimes dismissed as misidentification by untrained observers and sometimes generate the kind of careful follow-up that produces genuine discoveries. The river running community has generated a substantial oral literature of canyon anomalies. Stories of features seen and sometimes photographed in inaccessible locations. Stories of side canyons that seem to have been extensively modified, but that do not appear in any archaeological survey. Stories of encounters with landscape features that do not fit the natural geology and do not match the known archaeological record. Most of these stories, when investigated, turn out to have conventional explanations. Natural features can be startlingly regular in ways that suggest artificial modification, but that actually reflect the geometry of jointing patterns in the rock or the action of erosion on layered sediments. The trained archaeological eye sees things differently from the untrained eye, recognizing natural formation processes that the untrained observer might mistake for human action. But not all of the river-running observations can be dismissed so easily. Some of them have led to the documentation of legitimate archaeological sites that were previously unknown to the professional community. The canyon is simply too big and too complex for any survey to have been complete, and the river-running community, with its unusual access to the canyon's most remote sections, has served as an informal extension of the archaeological survey effort, identifying potential sites for professional follow-up. This informal, community-based observation is a resource that the archaeological community has not fully exploited. There are systematic ways to engage river runners and other regular visitors to the canyon's backcountry in formal site reporting programs, using trained observer protocols that would allow their observations to be evaluated and, where warranted, followed up. Some such programs exist. None has been implemented at a scale commensurate with the potential value of the observations available. Let us think about another neglected dimension of the canyon's human history. What happened here during the period between the ancestral Puebloan abandonment around 1300 AD and the arrival of the first European observers in 1540 AD, 240 years? That is a long time. Long enough for entire civilizations to rise and fall, for languages to change beyond recognition, for the human map of a region to be completely redrawn. And in the Grand Canyon region, those 240 years are almost archaeologically invisible. What do we know about them? We know that various groups were present in the canyon region during this period. The ancestors of the modern Navajo and Apache were moving into the southwest from more northerly regions, bringing with them a very different cultural tradition, rooted in the Athapascan-speaking world of subarctic North America. The ancestors of the Paiute and other Numic-speaking peoples were expanding across the Great Basin and into the canyon's northern approaches. The Hopi, on their mesatop villages to the northeast, were maintaining continuous occupation and cultural tradition from the ancestral Puebloan period through this transitional era. But what was happening specifically in the Grand Canyon during these 240 years? The archaeological record is sparse. It has not been adequately studied, and it represents a crucial transition period. The gap between the well-documented ancestral Puebloan occupation and the ethnographically documented historic-era tribal presence, a gap that is precisely where the connections between those two worlds would be most visible. If there were significant sites from this transitional period in the canyon, they would tell us about population continuity and change, about which elements of ancestral Puebloan tradition were maintained and which were lost, about the first encounters and interactions between the various incoming groups and the ancestral Puebloan remnant populations. They would help explain how the modern tribal map of the region came to be what it is. Some transitional period sites have been identified in the canyon region. They are not well studied. They are not prominent in the literature. They sit in the gap between the ancestral Puebloan narrative and the historic era narrative, documented but not adequately investigated, waiting for someone to give them the attention they deserve. This gap, this invisible 2.5-century period, is one of the most significant unresolved questions in the canyon's archaeological history. And it is a question that, given adequate resources and access, could be significantly advanced by targeted investigation of specific sites and specific deposits that have already been identified as potentially dating to this period. The canyon does not yield its history easily, but it does yield it to those who ask the right questions, with the right tools and the right patience. Consider the question of the canyon's role in the broader ceremonial geography of the American Southwest. The American Southwest is one of the most intensively ceremonial landscapes in the world, in the sense that the physical features of the landscape, mountains, springs, canyons, plains, are systematically incorporated into the religious and ceremonial life of the peoples who inhabit it, in a way that gives the entire landscape a kind of sacred significance. Every major geographical feature has a name, a story, a set of ceremonial associations. Every journey through the landscape is a journey through a map of spiritual significance. The Grand Canyon is central to this ceremonial geography in multiple traditions. The Hopi regard it as the Sipapu, the place of emergence. The Havasupai have a deep and multifaceted ceremonial relationship with its specific features. The Navajo incorporate canyon features into their creation narratives. The Zuni have traditions connecting their ancestors to the canyon's human history. The various human-speaking peoples along the Colorado River have ceremonial traditions that trace the river from its headwaters to the sea and invest every major feature of its passage through the canyon with spiritual significance. This ceremonial geography is not just a set of beliefs. It is a set of practices, of regular visits to specific locations, of pilgrimages along specific routes, of ceremonies performed at specific places at specific times. And the sites associated with these practices are often exactly the kinds of remote, inaccessible locations that the mainstream archaeological record does not include. Sites that are known to the ceremonial specialists of the relevant traditions, and that have been visited and used continuously for generations, but that have never been documented by outside researchers. Some of these ceremonially significant sites are undoubtedly among the most archaeologically interesting locations in the canyon. They are places that have been continuously used since the deepest periods of human occupation, places where the accumulated deposits of centuries of ceremonial activity would represent an extraordinary record of cultural continuity. But they are also places where archaeological investigation would be, at minimum, extremely sensitive, requiring the full and free consent of the relevant communities and the negotiation of protocols that would allow investigation to proceed without violating the sacred character of the site. This negotiation is possible. It has been done elsewhere. But it requires exactly the kind of sustained, respectful, relationship-based engagement that the archaeological community has not always been willing to invest in. It requires recognizing that the indigenous communities whose sacred sites are involved are not just informants or research partners, but rights holders, people with a legitimate claim to control over their own cultural heritage that takes precedence over the archaeological community's desire for access. When that recognition has been genuine and the relationships have been built with care and patience, the results have been extraordinary. Some of the most important archaeological work in the canyon region has been done in exactly this collaborative mode, producing knowledge that neither the archaeological community alone nor the indigenous communities alone could have generated. The whole, in these cases, has been more than the sum of its parts. The potential for this kind of collaborative investigation at ceremonially significant sites in the Grand Canyon is enormous. The obstacles are real but not insurmountable. The path forward exists. Whether it will be taken, with the seriousness and the resources and the respect that it requires, is a question whose answer will determine much of what we learn about the canyon's deepest mysteries in the coming decades. Let us talk about one specific and particularly striking documented anomaly that sits right at the boundary between the known and the unknown, a discovery that was made, properly documented, published in the appropriate literature, and then essentially forgotten about for decades, before being recently rediscovered by researchers taking a fresh look at old survey reports. In the late 1980s, a geologist conducting routine mapping work in a remote section of the canyon's western reaches, a section rarely visited, and not on any standard backcountry route, noted in her field notebook something she described as what appears to be a modified overhang with evidence of walling across the lower portion. She photographed it. She included a brief notation in her geological survey report, and she moved on because she was a geologist, not an archaeologist, and the anomalous feature was not what she was there to study. The report, with its notation and its photographs, went into the archive of the Geological Survey Agency that had commissioned the work. It sat there for more than 20 years. In the early 2010s, a researcher going through old geological survey reports, looking for geographical information relevant to an unrelated study, came across the notation and the photographs. She was an archaeologist, and she recognized immediately that what the geologist had photographed was not a natural feature. It was a constructed one. The walling across the lower portion of the overhang was clearly of human manufacture. The positioning of the feature, in an inaccessible location high on a canyon wall, was exactly the kind of positioning typical of certain categories of ancestral Puebloan storage and ceremonial structures. She submitted a proposal to investigate the site. It was approved, and a small team spent several days accessing the site using technical climbing equipment and conducting a surface survey. What they found was consistent with what the Geological Survey had documented, but considerably more extensive. The modified overhang contained a sequence of constructions representing multiple periods of use. The earliest material appeared to be consistent with the Archaic period, potentially more than 3,000 years old. The most recent appeared to be ancestral Puebloan, potentially from the Classic period of occupation. The site also contained rock art. A panel of pictographs executed in multiple styles, representing multiple periods of production. The earliest elements of the panel were in a style and execution so different from anything in the established regional typology that the researchers could not confidently assign them to any known cultural period. The site was documented. A report was written. The report was submitted to the relevant institutional authorities. It was recommended for follow-up investigation. The follow-up investigation has not happened. The site sits in its remote location, documented but not studied, known to the small number of people who read the report, but not to the broader research community, and certainly not to the public. This is the canyon's pattern, not suppression, not conspiracy, just the ordinary weight of institutional inertia, of limited resources, of competing priorities, of a research landscape in which there are always more important and accessible sites demanding attention than there are resources to attend to them. But somewhere in that remote location in the Western Canyon, that sequence of constructions and pictographs is waiting. The answers it might provide about the cultural sequence of the Western Canyon region, about the periods of occupation that predate the ancestral Puebloans, about the earliest use of that specific location, are waiting. They have been waiting for decades. They may wait for decades more. The canyon is patient. We are less so, and we should be. Because every year that passes is a year in which erosion and weathering and the occasional flash flood are erasing some fraction of the evidence. The window is not closed, but it is closing. Let us talk now about the canyon itself, the physical experience of being in it, because any exploration of its mysteries has to be grounded in some understanding of what it is actually like to be there. The first thing that strikes you, descending from the rim, is the silence. Not absolute silence, because the wind is usually present, and the birds of the canyon, the ravens and the canyon wrens, and the occasional peregrine falcon add their voices to the air, but a quality of silence that is fundamentally different from any silence available above the rim. The sounds of the human world, traffic and machinery, and the constant hum of modern civilization simply cannot penetrate the canyon walls. Whatever noise is made above is absorbed and blocked by the immensity of the rock. Inside the canyon, you are genuinely cut off. The second thing that strikes you is the heat, in summer at least, the fierce, reflected, inescapable heat of the inner gorge, where the dark Vishnu schist absorbs and radiates the desert sun, with a ferocity that has killed unwary hikers in every year of the canyon's recorded history. The temperature in the inner gorge can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in July, a heat that is not just uncomfortable but physiologically dangerous, a heat that can overwhelm the body's cooling systems within hours. The early inhabitants of the canyon understood this danger and responded to it with seasonal migration, spending the hottest months on the cooler plateaus above and descending to the inner canyon only when the temperature allowed. The rhythm of their occupation was the rhythm of the desert itself, a constant adjustment to conditions that demanded respect. The third thing that strikes you is the scale, which is obvious, but which continues to strike you at intervals throughout any time spent in the canyon, as new perspectives reveal new dimensions of the immensity that no single view can capture. From any given point in the canyon, you can only see a fraction of it. The walls curve and the ridges block the view, and the side canyons lead away in directions that have to be explored to be understood. The canyon is not a single vista, but a succession of vistas, each revealing some new aspect of the whole, without ever showing the whole itself. This disorienting quality of the canyon, this continuous partial revelation that refuses to resolve into a comprehensive view, is part of what makes it so enduring as a source of mystery. You cannot see it all at once. You cannot hold it in your mind as a single image. It is always bigger than what you have seen of it, always promising more beyond the next bend, more beneath the next layer, more in the direction you have not yet gone. And this, finally, is the deepest answer to the question of what scientists found at the Grand Canyon that shocked them. They found something too big to see whole, something too ancient to comprehend at once, something too complex to resolve into simple explanation. They found, at the scale of a landscape, the same fundamental condition that faces every serious scientific inquiry, the persistent excess of reality over our capacity to understand it. The canyon is more than we know. It is more than we can know, given our current tools and our current access and our current commitment of resources. It will continue to be more than we know, with each new investigation adding to the picture while also revealing new corners of the picture that remain unexplored. This is not a frustrating condition. It is the condition of genuine inquiry. It is what keeps the question alive. And the Grand Canyon, with its 2 billion years of patience and its 12,000 years of human history and its hundreds of documented anomalies and its unknown remainder of undocumented mysteries, is perhaps the finest example on Earth of a place that will continue to reward genuine inquiry for as long as inquiry persists. The scientists who were shocked by what they found there were shocked because the canyon exceeded their expectations, because it contained more than they had predicted, because the model they brought with them was insufficient to account for what they encountered. That has been the experience of every serious explorer of this place, from John Wesley Powell floating the river in 1869 to the geologists re-examining century-old reports in the second decade of the 21st century. The canyon exceeds the model. It is always more than you expected. And it will continue to be more than you expected, for as long as you are willing to keep approaching it with the openness of genuine curiosity rather than the closure of settled certainty. The walls are there. The layers are there. The questions are there. And you, wherever you are right now, in whatever time zone, at whatever point in the long arc of the night, are listening to a place that is still generating its mysteries, still accumulating its evidence, still waiting for the investigation it deserves. The Grand Canyon does not announce its secrets. It reveals them, slowly, partially, in fragments, to those who are willing to make the effort to seek them out. That effort is worth making. The secrets are worth finding. And the canyon, ancient and patient and impossibly vast, is not going anywhere. It is waiting. It is always waiting. And what waits inside its walls, in the darkness of its unexplored cave systems, and the silence of its inaccessible alcoves, and the long, patient memory of the stone itself, is something more extraordinary than any single discovery, any single revelation, any single headline could ever capture. It is the full human story of one of the greatest places on Earth. And we have only just begun to read it. There is one more thread we need to follow, a thread that leads not into the canyon's remote interior, but into the libraries and archives and forgotten correspondence files of the institutions that have been studying the canyon since the beginning of the modern era, because buried in those archives are stories of discoveries that were made and reported and then quietly faded from the record, not because they were suppressed, but because the institutions that received them did not know what to do with them. The history of American archaeology is littered with examples of finds that were ahead of their time, discoveries that the institutional framework of the period could not adequately process, that were received and acknowledged and then set aside because the conceptual tools to interpret them did not yet exist. The discovery of Kennewick Man in 1996, a 9,000-year-old human skeleton in Washington state, whose morphological features generated intense controversy about early American human diversity, is one of the more recent and well-known examples. But there are dozens of others, spanning the entire history of American archaeology, cases where something was found that did not fit, and that was therefore not suppressed, but deferred. Set aside, returned to later, if at all. Some of these deferred discoveries involve the Grand Canyon directly, not the dramatic 1909 story with its Egyptian connections, which belongs to the borderland between legend and documentation, but genuine archaeological finds, documented in genuine professional reports, that raise genuine questions that nobody followed up on adequately. One such case involves a small collection of figurines found in a cave in the canyon's central section in the early 1920s by a party of amateur explorers who reported their find to the Arizona State Museum. The figurines were ceramic, small, no more than 3 or 4 inches tall, and they depicted human figures in postures and with stylistic features that the museum staff who examined them found difficult to classify. The figures were clearly old. The condition of the ceramic and the nature of the clay and temper were consistent with pre-Columbian manufacture, but the style was unlike anything in the museum's existing comparative collection. The figurines were accessioned into the museum's collection, which is to say they were formally accepted as holdings and given accession numbers and a brief descriptive record. They were examined by 1 or 2 additional specialists over the following decade, neither of whom had a confident classification to offer. They were then essentially forgotten, sitting in a storage drawer for decades, not lost, but not studied, not published, not subjected to any of the analytical techniques that would later become available. In the 1990s, A researcher going through old accession records came across the brief documentation of the figurines and requested to examine them. They were found in good condition in a storage area. She examined them carefully and concluded that the stylistic features that had puzzled the museum staff in the 1920s were genuinely anomalous, that the figurines did not correspond to any established typological category in the region's ceramic sequence, and that they warranted systematic analysis. She conducted thermoluminescence dating on small samples of the ceramic. The dates came back ranging from roughly 1500 to 2000 years ago. This placed the figurines squarely within the period of known occupation in the canyon, but did not resolve the question of their cultural affiliation. The style remained anomalous. She published a paper presenting the figurines, their unusual stylistic features, and the dating results, and calling for further investigation. The paper was published in a regional archaeology journal. It was cited a handful of times over the following decade. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The figurines are still in the museum's collection. The questions they raise are still unanswered. They sit in their storage drawer, dated but not explained, documented but not understood, patient artifacts of a culture or a cultural moment that the existing framework of southwestern archaeology does not comfortably accommodate. This is not a sensational story. It is, in its way, more interesting than a sensational story, because it is a story about the actual practice of archaeology, about the institutional processes through which some discoveries get pursued and others get deferred, about the gap between what is found and what is understood. That gap, in the Grand Canyon specifically, is enormous. And it is growing in some respects, even as it shrinks in others, because new sites are being eroded faster than new analytical capacity can be brought to bear on them. Let us think about the canyon's future. What will we know about it, about its human history, in another 100 years? If the trend of the past century continues, we will know considerably more than we know now. Analytical techniques will continue to improve. The ancient DNA recovered from archaeological samples will continue to reveal the genetic history of the people who lived here. Stable isotope analysis will continue to trace diet and movement patterns. LiDAR will continue to reveal archaeological features invisible to conventional survey methods. The collaborative relationships with indigenous communities that produce the best results will, with care and persistence, continue to generate new interpretations of the evidence. But if current trends in archaeological funding and site protection continue unaltered, there will also be losses. Sites that could have been studied will have been eroded beyond recovery. Cave systems that might have contained intact deposits will have been disturbed by unauthorized visits or damaged by flooding. The organic materials that might have provided the most diagnostic evidence about ancient activities will have degraded beyond the ability of even the most sensitive future analytical techniques to retrieve useful information from them. The next 100 years will determine how much of the Grand Canyon's human history can ultimately be recovered. The decisions made now about funding and access and site protection and community partnership will shape what future researchers have to work with. This is not an abstract policy question. It is a question about what we value, about whether the extraordinary human history of this extraordinary place is something we consider worth the sustained effort and the sustained resources that adequate investigation would require. The answer to that question, in our current institutional and political environment, has been uncertain at best. Archaeological funding in America has been chronically inadequate. The National Park Service's budget for archaeological work in the Grand Canyon has never been commensurate with the scale of what is there. Academic research programs have been constrained by the funding realities of a university system under financial pressure. And yet the work continues, slowly, inadequately resourced, but persistently, because the people who have devoted their careers to understanding the Grand Canyon's human history are not doing it for the funding, they are doing it because the canyon demands it. Because the questions it raises are too important and too interesting to be left unanswered when the possibility of answering them still exists. That persistence, that slow, patient, underfunded accumulation of knowledge about a place that exceeds every attempt to fully understand it, is perhaps the deepest parallel between the scientists who study the Grand Canyon and the ancient people who lived in it. Both are engaged in the project of making themselves at home in a place that is fundamentally, irreducibly larger than any single human life can encompass. The ancestral Puebloans built their houses in the canyon's walls and tended their fields on its ledges and conducted their ceremonies in its kivas and told their stories about the world's origin in its depths. They did not understand everything about the canyon. No one ever has. But they lived in it, generation after generation, with a relationship to the place that was at once intensely practical and deeply reverential, a relationship in which the canyon was not just a backdrop for human activity, but a participant in it. The scientists who study it today are trying to recover some understanding of that relationship, of what it meant to make a home in this place, of what knowledge was accumulated, and what wisdom was encoded in the long span of human occupation here. They are, in a sense, trying to have a conversation across 12,000 years, using the mute language of artifacts and sediment and chemical traces to ask the people who lived here what they knew and what they thought and what they valued. It is an imperfect conversation. The gap in time is too great, the evidence too fragmentary, the cultural distance too large. But something comes through. Something about the scale of human intelligence and human adaptability and human creativity that was present in the Grand Canyon long before any European knew it existed. Something that challenges the old narratives of primitive isolation and simple subsistence and modest capacity. Something that says, we were here, we understood this place, we lived here well for a very long time. And the canyon, with its walls of 2 billion-year-old stone, and its corridors of geological time, and its sealed alcoves, and its unexplored cave systems, and its patient, persistent accumulation of evidence, says, yes, they were here, and you have only begun to understand what that means. The discoveries are still being made. The shocks are still being registered, quietly, in the publications of specialists and the notebooks of field workers and the storage drawers of regional museums. The story is still being assembled, piece by piece, from evidence that is simultaneously abundant and incomplete, and the canyon is still there. It is always still there, older than anything you can easily imagine, deeper than any story that has been told about it, more complex than any single explanation can capture. Scientists found things at the Grand Canyon that shocked them. They are finding them still. They will continue to find them, for as long as anyone is willing to look with the patience and the curiosity and the humility that the place demands. The mystery is not solved. The mystery is not going to be solved in any simple or final sense. But it is being unraveled, slowly, carefully, by the persistent effort of people who understand that the most extraordinary places deserve the most sustained and careful attention. And the Grand Canyon, 1 mile deep and 277 miles long and 2 billion years old, is exactly that. The most extraordinary place, the place that demands sustained and careful attention. It has been demanding it for 12,000 years. We are still, humbly, attempting to provide it. And the walls of stone, patient and ancient and full of secrets that are not secrets so much as questions we have not yet learned to ask in the right way, are waiting for us to get better at the asking. They have time. They always have time. The canyon breathes, the river runs, the shadows move across the faces of 2 billion-year-old stone. And somewhere in the depth of it, in the darkness and the silence and the ancient patience of the rock, the next discovery is already there, already waiting. Already, in its own geological way, almost ready to be found. There are things about the Grand Canyon that no amount of investigation will ever fully explain, not because the evidence has been suppressed or because the wrong questions are being asked, but because the scale of the place simply exceeds the capacity of any human institution to fully comprehend. You can spend a lifetime studying a single-side canyon and still leave questions unanswered that would require another lifetime to pursue. The canyon is larger than the sum of all investigations ever conducted within it. It will always be larger than that sum. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an invitation to a different kind of engagement, one that accepts incompleteness as the fundamental condition of the inquiry, rather than as a problem to be overcome. The Grand Canyon does not owe us a complete accounting of itself. It did not come into existence to satisfy human curiosity. It existed for 2 billion years before any human eye ever looked upon it, and it will continue to exist, in some form, long after the last human civilization has faded from the planet's surface. What we owe to the canyon and to ourselves is honest and sustained effort. Honest about what we know and what we do not know. Honest about the limits of our evidence and the extent of our uncertainty. Sustained in the sense of not giving up when the first wave of inquiry does not produce definitive answers, of coming back again and again with better tools and better questions and better relationships with the communities whose heritage is at stake. The people who found things at the Grand Canyon that shocked them were people who came with expectations and had those expectations exceeded. The canyon did that. It has always done that. It will continue to do that, to every serious investigator who approaches it with genuine openness. But the shock is not the point. The shock is just the beginning. The moment when the existing framework proves inadequate, when the model fails to account for what is actually there, is the moment when genuine inquiry begins. That moment, repeated over and over across the century and a half of scientific investigation of the canyon, is the engine of everything we now know about this place. And it will be the engine of everything we come to know in the future, as investigators with better tools and better questions and better partnerships continue the work of trying to understand what is in those walls, in those cave systems, in those oral traditions, in those storage drawers of regional museums, in the chemical signatures preserved in ancient sediments and ancient bone. The canyon waits. The work continues. The answers come, slowly, partially, in fragments that have to be assembled with patience and care into a picture that is always growing and never complete. That is the nature of the place. That is the nature of the inquiry it demands. And that, perhaps, is the most important thing that scientists found at the Grand Canyon when they went there looking for answers, and found instead a place that generates questions faster than any answer can resolve them. The greatest place is never the place that gives up all its secrets at once. The greatest place is the one that keeps giving you new reasons to come back. The Grand Canyon has been giving people new reasons to come back for 12,000 years. It shows no sign of stopping. And all of us, in our own way, whether we stand at the rim, or float the river, or sit in a library reading the reports of those who went before us, or lie in the dark, listening to a voice describe what is known and what is still unknown about this extraordinary place, all of us are part of the ongoing and never-finished project of trying to understand it. That project belongs to everyone. The canyon belongs to no one. And its secrets, the secrets that have been accumulating in its walls since long before the first human walked its rim, belong to the future, to the investigators and the explorers and the questioners who will come after us and push the inquiry further than we have been able to take it. We hand them what we know. We hand them the questions we have not been able to answer. And we trust the canyon to hand them what it has always handed to those who approach it with genuine curiosity and genuine respect, more than they expected, more than they can fully account for. More than any story, however long and however carefully told, can completely contain. The canyon is still there. The walls are still standing. The river is still running. And somewhere, in the darkness of an unexplored cave, or the silence of a remote tributary canyon, or the encoded language of a pictograph panel that no outside researcher has yet examined, the next chapter of the story is waiting to be read. It has been waiting a very long time. It will wait a little longer. It is very good at waiting. And when the right person comes, with the right questions, and the right tools, and the right relationships, and the right patience, it will give up what it holds, as it has always given up what it holds, slowly, partially, in the magnificent and maddening increments that are the only way a place this ancient and this vast can be known. One fragment at a time, one question at a time, one discovery at a time, the canyon of time, the canyon of stone. The canyon of 12,000 years of human life and 2 billion years of geological time, all layered together in a place so extraordinary that it generates wonder in everyone who encounters it and has been generating wonder in human beings for as long as human beings have been standing at its rim. You are one of those human beings. This is your canyon too. And whatever it still contains, whatever remains to be found in its depths, whatever questions it is still holding in the patience of its ancient stone, those questions belong to all of us. The mystery is shared. The wonder is shared. The canyon is shared. And the work of understanding it, the endless, patient, necessary, exhilarating work of trying to know a place that exceeds every attempt to fully know it, that work goes on. It always goes on. It will always go on, because the canyon will always be more than we know. And the human need to understand what is more than we know, the curiosity that drove the first people to stand at the rim and wonder what was at the bottom, the same curiosity that drove John Wesley Powell to float the river in a wooden boat in 1869, the same curiosity that drives archaeologists today to dangle from ropes on canyon walls in search of evidence that most people will never hear about in any publication with a wide circulation. That curiosity is as fundamental to what we are as the stone of the canyon is to what the canyon is. We are the species that needs to know. The canyon is the place that will never be fully known. That relationship between the need and the inexhaustible object of the need is what makes the Grand Canyon what it is, not just as a geological formation or as an archaeological site, but as a place in the human imagination, a place that has been generating stories and questions and wonder for as long as human beings have been capable of generating stories and questions and wonder. It generated them before writing existed to record them. It is generating them now. It will be generating them long after every person who has ever written about it, or studied it, or stood at its rim is gone. The canyon endures, the questions endure, the search endures. And somewhere, in the 2 billion years of stone that line its walls, the answers are patient. They are very, very patient. They have been waiting long enough that a few more years, or a few more decades, or a few more centuries of human searching is nothing to them. They will wait, and we will search. And eventually, in ways none of us can predict and with results that will certainly surprise us, some of what the canyon holds will become known. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to change the story again, enough to push the picture further toward truth, enough to honor the place and the people and the 12,000 years of human life that left their traces in the walls and the sediments and the oral traditions of the most ancient and extraordinary landscape in North America. The Grand Canyon is waiting. The search continues. The story is not over. It is never over. Not here. Not in this place. Not in the deepest canyon on the continent, where the river runs in the dark at the bottom of a mile of ancient stone, and the walls remember everything, and the questions are older than any answer we have managed to find. The canyon breathes, the river runs, the shadows move, and the mystery endures as it has always endured, as it will always endure, patient and vast and inexhaustible in the walls of the most ancient place in America. There is a particular hour in the Grand Canyon that people who have spent time in its depths know well, though it is not marked on any map and has no name in any geological survey. It is the hour just before dawn, when the darkness in the inner gorge is absolute, when the stars are still burning in the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls, and when the river sounds different than it does in any other hour, lower in pitch somehow, more deliberate, as though it is choosing its words carefully for the day ahead. In that hour, if you are camped on a river beach somewhere in the middle reaches of the canyon, you become aware of the full depth of what surrounds you, not just the geological depth, the mile of rock above you, though that is present and palpable in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not felt it, but the temporal depth, the sense that the darkness around you is not just the absence of light, but the presence of time, compressed into the walls and the floor of the gorge, in a way that makes the ordinary human experience of time feel very thin and very recent. In that hour, the question of what is in the canyon, of who was here, and what they found and what they left behind, feels less like a historical puzzle and more like a conversation happening in real time. The past is not past in the Grand Canyon. It is present, in the stone, in the river, in the traditions of the people whose ancestors lived here. It is available to be known if you approach it with the right posture, the posture of someone who understands that they are a visitor in a place that does not belong to them, a place that was here before them and will be here after them, a place that is, in some fundamental sense, still in the process of becoming what it is. The people who lived here understood that. They built their houses in its walls, not on top of it, not above it, but in it, inside it, as though they understood that the right relationship to the canyon was not one of dominance or mastery, but of habitation, of being genuinely at home in a place that was not made for them and did not need them, and would have been exactly what it was, with or without their presence. That understanding of how to be a guest in a landscape so ancient and so vast that human time is a thin veneer on its surface is one of the things that the investigation of the Grand Canyon's human history is ultimately about. Not just the dates and the ceramic types and the isotope ratios, but the question of what it means to live in a place like this, to make a home in walls of stone that were old before life existed on this planet, to orient your ceremonies to a sky that was turning before the first fish crawled onto land. The answers to that question are in the evidence. They are in the orientation of the kivas and the placement of the granaries and the selection of the spring sites and the acoustic properties of the ceremonial locations. They are in the pictograph panels that mark the passage of light across specific surfaces at specific times of year. They are in the oral traditions that encode knowledge of the landscape in the form of stories that are still being told. They are in the canyon itself, in its walls and its shadows, and its patient accumulation of everything that has ever happened here. The scientists who found things at the Grand Canyon that shocked them were finding edges of an answer that the canyon has been giving in its incomplete and fragmentary way for as long as anyone has been asking the question. The asking continues. The canyon continues. And in the hour before dawn, in the darkness of the inner gorge, with the stars burning above and the river choosing its words below, the question and the place exist together in a silence that is not emptiness but fullness, not absence but the presence of everything that has ever been here and everything that might yet be found. The canyon is not finished. It is never finished, and neither are we, in our patient, persistent, necessary effort to understand it. Let us close with the thing that the canyon itself seems to say, if you listen to it long enough and carefully enough and humbly enough to hear it. It says that the human story is longer and more complex and more varied and more extraordinary than any civilization has yet fully reckoned with. It says that the people who came before, in the long reaches of time before any written record, were not the primitive precursors of the real civilization, but were themselves engaged in the genuine and difficult and meaningful work of being human, in a world that demanded their full intelligence and their full creativity and their full capacity for social cooperation and their full reverence for the landscape that sustained them. It says that what we have built in the past 10,000 years, with our agriculture and our cities and our writing and our science and our technology, is not the story of progress from nothing to something, but the story of a transformation, one kind of human excellence trading for another, one kind of knowledge expanding as another contracts, one kind of relationship to the world replacing another, without the replacing being simply an improvement in every dimension. It says that the questions that matter most, about how to live in a landscape sustainably, about how to transmit important knowledge across generations, about how to organize communities that are resilient to the shocks that landscapes deliver, about how to maintain a relationship to the natural world that is reverential as well as practical. These questions were being worked on in the Grand Canyon for 12,000 years before anyone asked them in the form we recognize as scientific inquiry. And it says that the answers, whatever they ultimately prove to be, are not going to come from any single discovery or any single expedition or any single institutional decision to finally take the mysteries of this place seriously. They are going to come from the long, patient, collaborative, adequately resourced, indigenous, community-inclusive investigation that this place has always deserved and has not yet fully received. The canyon is waiting for that investigation. The canyon has always been waiting. And the people who have devoted their lives to beginning to provide it, the archaeologists and the geologists and the ethnographers and the oral historians and the indigenous knowledge keepers and the river runners and the photographers and the naturalists and the writers who have tried to put words to what the canyon contains, all of them are part of something larger than any of their individual contributions. They are part of the human attempt to understand one of the greatest places that has ever existed. That attempt is ongoing. It will continue to be ongoing. And the canyon, with its walls of stone that remember everything, and its river that carries everything toward the sea, and its silence that holds more history than any library yet assembled, will continue to be here, receiving those attempts, yielding what it yields, holding what it holds, patient and ancient and inexhaustible. The scientists found things at the Grand Canyon that shocked them. They will find more. There is always more. There is always, in this place, always more. The canyon floor is dark now. The river runs in the dark. The stars are turning above the narrow strip of sky between the walls. And in the darkness, in the stone, in the ancient and patient accumulation of everything that has ever happened here, the next discovery is waiting. It is waiting with the patience of 2 billion years of stone. It is waiting with the patience of 12,000 years of human presence and human memory and human reverence for this extraordinary place. It is waiting for the right question asked in the right way, by the right person, at the right moment, in the long and ongoing history of human inquiry into the most ancient and most extraordinary canyon on the face of the earth. That question may have already been asked. The discovery may already be in a report, in an archive, in a storage drawer, waiting to be recognized for what it is. Or the question may not yet have been asked. The discovery may be in a cave that has not yet been entered, in a deposit that has not yet been excavated, in a tradition that has not yet been shared with the outside world. Either way, it is there. It is always there, because the canyon always has more than we know. That is its nature. That is its gift to everyone who has ever been willing to ask. The canyon is not finished with its secrets. We are not finished with the canyon. The story continues. It always continues here, in the walls of ancient stone, in the voice of the river, in the turning of the stars above the deepest canyon in North America. It continues now, as you listen. It will continue long after you have drifted into sleep, long after all the words have faded and only the sense of the place remains. The vast, ancient, patient, inexhaustible place, where the human story and the geological story and the astronomical story all come together in a canyon that was here before us and will be here after us, and holds, in its walls of stone, everything that has ever happened here. Everything. Still waiting, still patient, still here. The Grand Canyon does not explain itself. It simply exists, vast and ancient and full of what has happened here, and it waits for the ones who are curious enough and patient enough and humble enough to approach it on its own terms and ask what it holds. Those people have always come. They are coming still. They will come after us, with better tools and better questions, and the canyon will give them what it gives everyone who comes in that spirit. More than they expected. More than they can immediately account for. More than any single story can contain. That is what the Grand Canyon is. That is what it has always been. That is what it will always be. The inexhaustible place. The place that is always more than you know. The canyon